Hello fellow sapiens and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Before we begin, take a breath. Wherever you are, lying in bed, driving through the night, cooking dinner, or quietly working with headphones in, this story is told slowly, softly, scientifically. So you can relax your brain, not overload it. This isn't clickbait, it's deep time. This is where the noise fades and the long story of humanity begins to unfold. One careful, humble chapter at a time. Now, if this kind of content helps you, if it keeps you company before sleep, or makes your commute feel a little less pointless, or just reminds you how strange and smart your species really is, consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you think. Not just me, but anyone else out there who's searching for something quieter, and it tells the algorithms that maybe curiosity deserves a little more oxygen in this world. Also, I'd love to know, how do you use this story? Is it part of your evening wind down? A ritual while cooking? Let me know in the comments. Whether you're drifting off or locked in focus, I made this for you. And just so you know, if you happen to fall asleep during one of the chapters, it's okay, I've put timestamps in the description so you can pick it up the next day, right where you left off. Because this story, from beginning to end, is worth hearing. This is not fantasy, not myth, not speculation, just real science told slowly, with no promises of certainty, no gods in the gaps, just humble archaeology, cautious genetics, and a quiet voice, trying to make sense of the bones we left behind. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's begin. Tonight's story is called The Migrations That Failed, Why Homo Sapiens Vanished Again and Again. A journey through 150,000 years of forgotten exits, dead-end wanderers, and the strange truth that we once left and then disappeared. What exactly were we before we became us, before the migrations, before the beads, before the graves and ochre? What was a Homo sapien when the world didn't yet know our name? It is one of those questions that seems simple until you try to answer it. Because what we call us did not appear in a flash. There was no morning when some ancestral being rubbed their forehead and became modern. The first Homo sapiens was not born under a banner or a new sun. They were born as any child is born. And they would not have known they were something different. They would not have known that we would someday look back and call them a beginning. If there is a beginning, it does not start in one place. But the earliest signpost we have so far is in the northwest of Africa, in a place that once looked nothing like it does today. Jebel Irhoud, in what is now Morocco, is a rocky outcrop that would not draw your eye. But beneath it, within ancient breccia, were the fragments of a face, a brow, a jaw, and a story that had to be rewritten. The fossils found at Jebel Irhoud were first thought to be only around 40,000 years old. That would make them late, maybe even intrusive. But dating the flint tools buried in the same layers told a very different story. The tools had been heated, and the stone remembers fire. Using a method called thermoluminescence, scientists determined that the artifacts and the bones were closer to 315,000 years old. This would place them as the earliest known remains of Homo sapiens, at least as far as we know today. But these bones were not exactly like ours. The face was flat, yes, the jaw small, and the teeth tucked into a modern shape. But the brain case was long and low, more archaic than familiar. In modern humans, the back of the skull is rounded, globular. In Irhoud, it is stretched. The volume of the brain may have been similar, but the shape was not. This tells us something quiet and profound. Becoming human was not just a matter of thinking more, it was a matter of thinking differently. This change in brain shape did not happen overnight. It likely emerged over tens of thousands of years, perhaps even longer. What we now call the modern human brain is not only larger than that of earlier hominins, but reorganized. The parietal lobes, which handle things like spatial reasoning and sensoromotor integration, became more prominent. The cerebellum, associated with fine motor skills and perhaps even aspects of cognition, expanded. But we do not fully understand what these changes meant in the lived experience of those early Homo sapiens. We only know that they occurred, and that they became part of the shape we now wear. Far to the east, in what is now Ethiopia, two more names quietly mark the map of our emergence: Omo and Herto. In the lower Omo Valley, near the Kibish Formation, a set of skeletal remains was uncovered in the late 20th century. The layers they were found in were complex, a mixture of river deposits and volcanic ash. But thanks to the dating of a nearby tuff, a kind of rock made from compressed ash, researchers could estimate the fossils at around 195,000 years old. These too belong to Homo sapiens. The Omois skull shows a mix of traits: a rounded cranial vault more like ours, but also a robust frame and thicker brow ridges than most people today. Again, not a leap, but a step. A little younger, at around 160,000 years ago, the 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 fossils, also from Ethiopia, add another layer to this story. The 𝐓𝐶 skulls are more complete and show a blend of modern and archaic traits, especially in the adult male cranium with its long vault and heavily built face. When first discovered, the researchers gave them a subspecies name, Homo sapiens idaltu, elder or firstborn. Not all agree with this classification, and today the fossils are usually just called early anatomically modern humans, but the sentiment remains. These people, living near what would have been a massive lake in the Pleistocene Rift Valley, were some of the earliest humans we can recognise as kin. These were not just scattered individuals, they were part of populations, and those populations were not identical. The humans at Jebel Irhoud were likely as different from those in Ethiopia as people from opposite ends of a continent might be today. In fact, recent studies of ancient and modern DNA suggest that our ancestors may have evolved in a network of semi-isolated populations across Africa. This idea, sometimes called the African multi-regionalism model, suggests that early Homo sapiens did not emerge from a single cradle, but from a braided stream of evolving groups who occasionally exchanged genes, tools, and perhaps ideas. So while one lineage was experimenting with long, narrow skulls in the northwest, another was rounding out the brain case in the east, and others, whom we have not yet found, may have been doing something else entirely. The fossil record of Central and Western Africa remains thin. The stories are still buried, but we can say with some confidence that by around 300,000 years ago, the African continent was home to diverse groups of Homo sapiens. They would have looked different from one another. They might not have recognised one another as part of the same world, but together they were becoming what we now are. This slow becoming was not only in the skull, it was in the hands. The tools found alongside early Homo sapiens are often classified as Middle Stone Age. They include points, scrapers, and blades made with more refined methods than the Acheulean hand axes used by their predecessors. One of the key techniques was called the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒 method. It involves shaping a core of stone in such a way that a final flake could be struck off with a precise form. Predictable, efficient, elegant. This is not the kind of skill that emerges accidentally. It suggests planning and teaching. The nappers of Jebel Irhoud and 𝐓𝐶 were not simply bashing rocks together. They were working with intention. We also see early signs of symbolic behaviour, though they are rare and debated. In some sites dated to this general period, ochre, a reddish iron-rich pigment, appears. Ochre can be used in hide processing, as a sunscreen, or as a component of adhesive, but it can also be used to mark the skin, or the dead. At 𝐓𝐶, cut marks on the skulls suggest ritual treatment. One of the adult skulls appears to have been defleshed, then polished. Was it an ancestor, a rival, a warning? We do not know. And that is the honest answer. What we do know is that by this time, Homo sapiens were not alone. Other hominins, from the Neanderthals of Europe to the mysterious Denisovans of Asia, to still unknown groups within Africa, all shared the world with these early humans. But within Africa itself there is no clear moment of domination, no single site that marks the rise. Instead, there is persistence, complexity, and diversity. Some populations, like those in Omo or 𝐓𝐶, may have continued for thousands of years. Others may have disappeared, leaving no trace but a few teeth or a scatter of stone. And some, perhaps, were absorbed into larger gene pools, their identities melting into a wider river. When we say anatomically modern humans, we are speaking in categories made by scientists. But those categories are always a little arbitrary. Bones do not label themselves. And evolution does not draw clean lines. The people of Jebel Irhoud would not have known they were more primitive than the people of 𝐓𝐶. The people of Omo would not have cared that their skull shape would someday be considered more globular. They were all just people, making tools, cooking food, living near water, watching the skies, and perhaps that is the most grounding realization. These earliest Homo sapiens were not prototypes. They were not half-finished beings on their way to us. They were fully alive, fully adapted to their time. If they had vanished, if no later wave had emerged, they would have still been a valid endpoint of evolution. We are not the goal of their story. We are just the thread that happened not to break. So what were we? Before we became us, we were many things. A brow wider here, a brain rounder there, a culture that burned bones, a face that faced the wind. There was no single invention, no dramatic leap, just a slow turning of the clay, shaped by environment, pressure, and chance. And somewhere in that mix, through droughts, floods, predators, and births, a species was forming that would eventually walk out into the wider world. But for now, in this time, there were only humans, young, strange, ancient humans, living across a continent so vast that even now we cannot map it fully, sharing traits but not yet a story, holding hands but not yet a name. And the haunting question that lingers as we end this chapter of the past is not just when we became us, but how many other versions there were, how many beginnings vanished, how many other kinds of human will never be found because their bones did not fossilize, or because we have not yet asked the right questions. That too is part of science, not knowing, and continuing anyway, quietly, carefully, humbly, because the only way to know where we began is to keep digging. If we all came from Africa, where exactly in Africa? It's a question that has shaped entire scientific careers, political ideologies, and late-night dorm room debates. A question that implies something fixed, something rooted, as if the birth of our species could be pinned to a single patch of soil. For more than a century, researchers searched for that patch, the original womb of Homo sapiens. Some imagined a lush Eden nestled between rivers. Others pointed to a highland lake or a sun-baked gorge. But in trying to find the one place we began, we may have been asking the wrong question. Because the closer we look at the African record from between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, the more scattered the pieces become. Not chaotic, not random, but distributed, woven, as if our origins were never a single spark but a long, slow glow flickering across a vast and changing continent. The idea of a single cradle of humankind is elegant in its simplicity, and for a time it was useful. In the mid-20th century, as fossils like the Omo skulls and the 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 remains were emerging from East Africa, it seemed plausible to draw a circle around the Rift Valley and call it the place. The idea that humans came out of East Africa became a shorthand for both geographic origin and narrative order, and it made a kind of intuitive sense. After all, the Rift hosts some of the oldest archaeological and fossil evidence of early hominins. The geology is favourable for preservation. The tectonics expose layers of deep time. The volcanoes leave ashbeds that can be dated. In short, it's a good place to find bones. But just because a fossil is found somewhere does not mean it came from there, and just because a place gives us a clue does not mean it holds the whole answer. Recent discoveries have forced us to expand our vision beyond the rift, beyond any one region, and to think of early Homo sapiens as not emerging from a cradle, but from a braided stream. A tangled, slow-flowing network of populations spread across the African continent, each contributing a thread to the fabric we now call us. At the core of this rethinking is the simple but unsettling observation that early Homo sapiens fossils do not all look the same. The skull from Jebel Irhoud in northwestern Africa has a modern-looking face but an elongated archaic brain case. The Omois skull from the southwest of Ethiopia has a rounded cranium but thick brow ridges and a sturdy frame. The 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 fossils, just a bit younger, show a different blend again. And then there are partial remains from places like Florisbad in South Africa, dated to around 260,000 years ago, that seem to fall somewhere between archaic and modern, a mix of ancestral and derived traits that don't slot neatly into categories. This variation is not noise, it is the signal. These are not failed attempts at becoming modern. They are populations adapting, evolving, exchanging genes and ideas across landscapes that were anything but static. Africa in this period was not a flat stage. It was a shifting quilt of forests, grasslands, deserts, and lakes. Climate cycles oscillated every few tens of thousands of years, expanding and contracting ecological corridors. populations would have formed, split, reconnected, and faded. Some would have lived in isolation for thousands of years. Others may have interbred with nearby groups when rivers swelled and game paths opened. Genetic data adds weight to this picture. Studies of modern African genomes show more diversity than any other population on Earth. This is not just due to population size or age. It reflects deep, structured diversity within Africa itself. Some genetic lineages coalesced more than 250,000 years ago, suggesting that ancestors of Homo sapiens were already genetically subdivided into different groups long before we can trace any global expansion. And this diversity is not random either. It reflects regional structure, meaning that people in southern Africa, eastern Africa, central Africa, and perhaps even northern zones all carried different threads of what would later become the full Homo sapiens genome. One way to visualize this is not as a family tree with a single trunk, but as a river delta. Many shallow channels, some intertwining, some flowing in parallel, all contributing to a wider basin, a braided stream. And while any one of those channels might not have led to us on its own, their convergence over time produced something new. This model is not without its problems. Fossil and archaeological records remain patchy in much of Africa. Central and western regions in particular have been underrepresented, due both to preservation challenges and to historical underinvestment in research infrastructure. But hints are starting to emerge. In Nigeria's 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 site, a partial skull was discovered that dates to only about 13,000 years ago, yet it retains features that seem more archaic than expected for such a recent time. Some researchers have proposed that this may reflect the survival of a deeply divergent lineage of Homo, one that had limited contact with the main Homo sapiens population. Others suggest it simply shows how much variation there has always been within our species. Either way, it underscores the point. The African human story is more complex than we thought. Archaeological evidence paints a similar picture. Tool traditions, once assumed to belong to a single culture or phase, now appear across wide regions and time spans. The Middle Stone Age, the technological stage most associated with early Homo sapiens, includes tools that range from the finely prepared Levallois flakes of the north to the elongated points and scrapers of the south. These were not isolated innovations. Similar techniques emerge again and again in different places, sometimes coexisting with older methods. This suggests not a single technological revolution, but a series of local evolutions, each responding to its own needs, environments, and perhaps cultural preferences. In southern Africa, sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 and Border Cave reveal early use of hafted tools and even compound adhesives, indicating a grasp of chemistry and planning. In Central Africa, obsidian points appear alongside grinding stones. In the east, traces of pigment processing and organised hearths show a concern for both survival and expression. These patterns imply networks, not global, but regional, through which ideas and objects could move. And while we don't yet know how far these exchanges went, or how often they occurred, they offer another thread in the braided model. Not just shared genes, but shared knowledge. Even in the realm of symbolic behaviour, which has often been held up as a marker of modernity, the evidence is diverse and scattered. In the Kaptharin Formation of Kenya, there is tentative evidence of ochre use going back more than 280,000 years. In the Klaces River caves of South Africa, charred shells and hearths show long-term occupation with possibly symbolic food choices. But these do not cluster in one region. They are not confined to a single culture. They flicker across the continent like stars emerging in dusk. Not one flare, but a constellation. To say there was no single cradle is not to say there was no origin. Homo sapiens did evolve in Africa. But in Africa must be allowed to mean something richer than one point on a map. It means across Africa. Within Africa, through Africa. In the folds and basins and riverbanks where people lived and died and remembered. The species we now call modern human is perhaps the result of a long continental conversation, one carried not in words, but in genes, stones, and fire. There is a deep humility in this view. It reminds us that the categories we build, species, cultures, modern, archaic, are tools, not truths. Useful, but temporary. The bones in Jebel Irhoud are not less human because their skulls were longer. The people of Omo are not more human because their heads were rounder. These are our projections, our boxes. Nature did not label them. and the fossils, for all their silence, do not obey our definitions. We may never find the first Homo sapiens. The idea of a first is seductive but misleading. It imagines a line drawn in time, a border crossed in a moment. But evolution does not work like that. It is a gradient, a slow accumulation. At some point, traits we now call modern reached a threshold. But that threshold was not marked, it was lived. So if we must imagine a cradle, let it not be a basin but a continent. Let it not be a point but a web. Let it be a place where the wind carried stories we'll never hear, and where fire cracked in hearths that no one remembers. A place where different kinds of humans looked at each other, perhaps puzzled, perhaps familiar, and chose to stay or to leave. And the haunting question is not where we came from. It is how many Africas we carry in us still. How many versions of being human never left their mark. How many languages died unspoken. How many tools were lost in sand. How much of us is built from ancestors we'll never know. Because what we call modern humanity was not born in one place. It was composed, and like any composition, its beauty lies not in simplicity, but in harmony, in the overlapping notes, in the subtle variations, in the quiet understanding that we were never just one thing. We were always many, and still are. What was a modern human doing in Greece over 200,000 years ago? It is not a rhetorical question. It is a literal one. And the reason it matters is because until very recently, we did not believe that was even possible. For decades, the model was clean, or at least it pretended to be. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa. They stayed in Africa. Then, around 60,000 years ago, they left, moved into the Near East, into Europe, into Asia, and they stayed. That was the version printed in textbooks. That was the version taught in classrooms. But every so often a piece of bone disagrees. In the southern reaches of Greece, along the western coast of the Peloponnese, there is a cave carved into a cliff overlooking the sea. Today it is known as Apodema. From the outside it does not seem remarkable, but within that rock face are some of the most quietly haunting fossils ever found. They were discovered in the late 1970s by Greek scientists excavating breccia deposits, ancient sediments turned to stone, sealed within the walls. 2 partial skulls were recovered. They were named Apodema 1 and Apodema 2, and for decades they sat, untouched, uncertain, misunderstood. Apodema 2 came first. It was more complete. A face, a brain case, enough to identify it as Neanderthal, or at least that was the consensus. The features fit. Long low cranium, sloping forehead, prominent brow ridges. It seemed to confirm the story everyone already believed. Neanderthals were in Europe during the Middle Pleistocene. This skull, dated to around 170,000 years ago, matched that narrative perfectly. It was published, catalogued, accepted. But Apodema 1 was stranger. It was less complete. Just the back half of a skull. A fragmentary occipital region with no face, no jaw. And it was distorted, crushed slightly by pressure, encased in rock with no clear stratigraphic context. For years, no one was sure what to do with it. It did not look Neanderthal, but it also did not look entirely modern. It was shelved, figuratively and literally, filed as uncertain, and there it remained, until new imaging techniques arrived. In the 21st century, a group of researchers revisited the Apodema fossils using high-resolution computed tomography. They digitally reconstructed the skulls, correcting for distortion and loss, and when they looked again at Apodema 1, they saw something unexpected. The back of the skull was rounded, globular, not elongated. There was no occipital bun, no Neanderthal flattening. The curvature matched modern humans more closely than any other species. It was not just a vague resemblance. When the researchers ran morphometric analyses, essentially shape comparisons across known fossil samples, Apodema 1 consistently grouped with Homo sapiens. Not Neanderthal, not 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒, sapiens. And when they applied uranium series dating to the calcite that coated the fossil, they got a date of at least 210,000 years, possibly older. If correct, that would make Apodema 1 the earliest known Homo sapiens fossil outside Africa. Older than Homo, older than 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒, and planted not in the Levant or Arabia, but deep in southern Europe, a place long thought to be Neanderthal homeland during this period. This claim sparked immediate debate, and rightly so. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary scrutiny. Some paleoanthropologists questioned whether the fragment was diagnostic enough. Others pointed to the challenges of dating material without clear stratigraphy. But the features were there: the shape of the occipital bone, the absence of Neanderthal traits, the digital reconstructions held up. And even if the fossil could not be placed with perfect precision, it refused to fit the old story. If Epidema 1 truly belonged to a Homo sapiens individual and truly lived over 200,000 years ago, it implies that modern humans had reached Europe far earlier than we ever imagined. But here is the catch. There are no descendants, no cultural continuity, no genetic legacy we can trace. Whoever this human was, and whichever group they belonged to, they did not last. This perhaps is what makes Epidema so haunting. It is a fossil without a footprint, a ghost presence. The idea that a small band of Homo sapiens might have wandered northward across Africa, slipped past the Mediterranean, and found their way into the forests and hills of the Balkans, only to vanish, is both plausible and unsettling. It reframes Europe not as a stage entered during a great migration, but as a place touched and abandoned more than once. It also complicates the story of Neanderthals, because the younger skull, Epidema 2, is separated from Epidema 1 by nearly 40,000 years, and yet they were found within the same breccia deposit, in the same cave wall, just a few feet apart. One skull belonged to a modern human who arrived early and left no trace, the other to a Neanderthal who appeared later and held the land longer. The cave was used twice, by different kinds of humans, neither aware of the other, neither likely knowing they had shared the same stone centuries apart. The symbolism writes itself. A cave with two skulls, one modern, one Neanderthal, one older, one younger. But their sequence defies expectation. The Homo sapiens came first, then the Neanderthal. The direction of replacement is reversed, and this is not a speculative reversal. It is measured, dated, preserved in the stone. What this suggests, carefully, cautiously, is that Homo sapiens may have made multiple attempts to expand into Europe long before the final successful migration. These were not invasions. They were not conquests. They were likely small-scale dispersals, climate-driven, resource-driven, or simply the result of curiosity. A band follows a river, crosses a valley, finds shelter in a cave, and for a while they live, but eventually they leave, or die, or are absorbed. The genetic evidence tells us that almost all living humans outside Africa today descend from a population that left between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. There is no sign that Epidema 1 contributed to that story. No ancient DNA, no cultural artifacts, no enduring lineage, just a skull, a round, forgotten skull. Why didn't they stay? That too is unknowable. Climate may have played a role. Europe during this period was volatile, glacial cycles, ecological upheaval, fluctuating prey. Neanderthals were better adapted to cold environments. They had lived in the region for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew its rhythms. A small population of sapiens, entering unfamiliar territory with unfamiliar challenges, may have simply failed to compete. But failure is a human word. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is more accurate to say they did not persist. And that too is normal. Most populations do not. Survival is the exception. Extinction is the rule. There is also the possibility, remote but not impossible, that there were more such populations, that Epidema 1 was not alone, that other modern humans made similar forays into Europe or adjacent regions, but their remains have not been found, or were found but not recognized, or recognized but dismissed. The fossil record is a lottery. It preserves what it wants, and sometimes what it preserves is enough to upend a narrative. Epidema does not just challenge timelines, it challenges expectations. It forces us to ask what we mean by modern. If a skull from 210,000 years ago shares our anatomy but not our history, what does that make them? A prototype? An ancestor? Or just another branch that happened to sprout in our direction and then break? There is a tendency, especially in popular science, to see every early Homo sapiens as part of a teleological march toward us. But there were many versions of us. Some stayed in Africa, some went north. Some crossed rivers and deserts, some left traces, others did not. And the ones who left Europe after Epidema may have done so quietly, or simply disappeared. If Apodema 1 is truly Homo sapiens, then the history of our species is not just older, but broader than we thought. It is not the story of a single migration, but of repeated reachings out, some successful, some forgotten, some preserved only in the shape of bone. And so the haunting question remains: how many more Apodemas are still buried in walls? How many humans walked into places we did not expect, at times we never imagined, only to vanish again into time? They were not myths, they were not metaphors, they were people, real people, carved by the same pressures, shaped by the same fears, touched by the same fires. Their stories ended, but the rock remembered, and for that we are grateful. Because every once in a while a ghost steps out of the stone, and we listen. Did we live in the same caves before we knew who we were? It's not a metaphor. It is a question anchored in stone, in hearths, in chipped flint and burned bone. Because before Homo sapiens became the planet's most stubborn resident, before symbolic culture stretched from cave walls to satellites, there were small, quiet pulses of movement. Some succeeded, most did not. But in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, nestled in the limestone slopes of Mount Carmel, a collapsed cave remembers one of them. Misliya Cave does not look like much from a distance. To modern eyes it appears as an overhang, a breach in the rock wall just south of present-day Haifa. But beneath the fallen ceiling, within the compacted sediments and ancient flowstones, are traces of something older than almost anyone expected. A jawbone, tools, charcoal, burnt stone, and perhaps most compelling of all, order. Not the chaos of natural fire or the randomness of wind-blown ash, but the deliberate remains of lives lived in place. One of the most intriguing questions is how this population got there. We cannot draw a dotted line on a map from their origin to Mount Carmel. But given the time range, it is possible that they were part of a broader northward expansion from northeastern Africa. The corridor through the Sinai Peninsula was open during certain climate windows. Habitats would have connected rather than divided regions, and for a time at least humans walked north. It was in the early 2000s that excavations at Misliya began to reveal their depth, literally and historically. Stratigraphic layers more than 3 meters thick, cemented with time, were carefully chiselled apart. What emerged was a sequence of human occupation unlike any other known at the time in the region. Within the deposits, archaeologists found a partial upper jawbone, a maxilla, with several teeth still intact. It was fossilised, heavily mineralised, but distinct. And when it was dated using a combination of uranium series and electron spin resonance techniques, the age range came back between 177,000 and 194,000 years ago. That alone would have been enough to redraw a few lines on a map. But the jaw was not Neanderthal. It was not some transitional Homo heidelbergensis. It was modern, or at least anatomically within the Homo sapiens range. The shape of the dental arcade, the morphology of the teeth, the structure of the bone, all pointed in one direction. This was, as far as we currently know, one of the earliest Homo sapiens fossils found outside of Africa. And it was not alone. Scattered throughout the same deposits were the signatures of daily life, tools shaped with the Levallois method, where a flint core is prepared in such a way that the final flakes, points, scrapers, blades, come off in precise planned forms. This technique was not new in the broader timeline, but its presence here, alongside the fossil, reinforced the association. These were not scavenged artefacts. They were made and used by the same people whose bones were buried there. There were other traces too: burnt bones, charcoal, heated flint, microscopic residues of ash layers, alternating with deposits of charred vegetal tissue, in some cases preserved in such detail that they still retained their cellular structure. Using micromorphology, scanning electron microscopy, and even Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, researchers examined these layers and found evidence of deliberate fire use. Not just accidental burning, but organised hearths. In some cases, the remains of what might have been bedding, mats, or layers of grasses and fibres, arranged near fire, partially charred, compressed by time. It is difficult to overstate how rare this level of preservation is. Fire destroys, sediment distorts. But here, under the collapsed ceiling of Misliya, a snapshot of early human behaviour survived. Not just the biological trace of a jaw, but the behavioural trace of domestic space, and yet this was not a permanent settlement. The cave was occupied, abandoned, reoccupied. Stratigraphy shows breaks, gaps between layers of use. Sometimes thousands of years passed between one lens of ash and the next. The climate was fluctuating. The region would have oscillated between grasslands, woodlands, and dry scrub. These early Homo sapiens groups likely moved seasonally, following game or responding to ecological shifts. The cave was a waypoint, a shelter, perhaps a place remembered and returned to, perhaps not, but not for long. There is no sign that the Misliya population left descendants in the region, no unbroken cultural sequence, no genetic evidence carried forward. They appear and then they are gone, like apodema, like other hints we have yet to find. Their presence is real, but their legacy is silence. And yet, what they left behind matters, because for decades the story of Homo sapiens was told as if it had clean edges, a neat emergence in Africa, a delayed expansion into Eurasia, a sudden replacement of other hominins. But sites like Misliya complicate that timeline. They show that Homo sapiens tried earlier, reached farther, settled, however briefly, in places we did not expect. The expansion was not a single wave, it was pulses, some successful, some forgotten. Misliya is also a reminder that humans, real humans, lived long before the cultural explosion we often associate with modernity. These people had no cave art, no bone flutes, no carved figurines, but they shaped tools, used fire, possibly built bedding. Their lives were not marked by grand symbols, but by subtle precision. Flint shaped in predictable ways, fires built and rebuilt in the same spot, bones cooked, discarded, stepped on, buried, and they were not alone. While we will not mention the other sites here, we know from later and earlier layers elsewhere that the Levant was a crossroads, not just between regions but between species. But even without naming them, it is enough to say that Misliya may have stood at the edge of a frontier, not just geographic, but evolutionary. Perhaps the most fascinating layer of this site is what it doesn't tell us. The Misliya Jaw is silent on language, on memory, on identity. Did its owner know they were different from others? Did they think of their group as a people, or just as a family? Did they return to this cave because of familiarity, or by accident? And when they left, if they left, what did they carry with them? We do not know, and we must say that plainly. Science is built not only on discovery but on restraint, on knowing when to say, not yet. Misliya offers us a precious glimpse into early Homo sapiens life outside of Africa. But it does not offer us conclusions. It opens doors, but does not walk through them. Still, the firelight remains, traces of warmth, of comfort, of memory we can no longer access. A jawbone smiles faintly through time. The sediments whisper of people who slept on grasses, who cooked, who chipped stone by hand, who sat together by flame. They were not mythical, they were not primitive, they were people, like us, but not quite. And so we ask again, did we live in the same caves before we knew who we were? It seems we did, and then we forgot. But the cave remembered. Could our deepest roots be buried far from the coasts? For a long time, the search for human origins clung tightly to the edges of things. Riverbanks, rifts, coastlines, places where fossils were easiest to find, where sediment could trap bones and erosion could later reveal them. These were the visible windows into deep time, and they gave us the first glimpses of Homo sapiens. Skulls shaped in eastern valleys, tools chipped near ancient lakes, traces of pigment in caves close to the sea. But Africa is not a story of edges alone. Much of its past unfolded in the dry heart of the continent, far from the dramatic geography of escarpments and shorelines. And in the southern interior, in a region we now call the Kalahari, lies a landscape that may have quietly shaped some of our most ancient traits, not through grand migrations, but through isolation, persistence, and memory. The Kalahari Basin stretches across much of modern-day Botswana, spilling into Namibia and parts of South Africa. Today, it appears as a vast semi-arid region, marked by open savannas, sandy soils, and seasonal pans that swell with water only after heavy rains. But this dry simplicity is deceptive. Beneath the dust lies a mosaic of ancient riverbeds, fossil lakes, and deep groundwater systems, traces of a hydrological past far wetter than the present suggests. And it's in this inland world, not tied to the drama of oceans or mountain ranges, that some of the earliest stories of our species may have taken shape. In recent years, paleo-environmental studies have begun to reshape how we understand the Kalahari's role in early human evolution. Geological cores from ancient lake beds like Magadik-Gadi and Ngami reveal that between 200,000 and 130,000 years ago, much of the region supported large freshwater bodies. These lakes would have been fed by seasonal rains and possibly even by ancient river systems now lost beneath dunes. During these wetter phases, the Kalahari was not a desert. It was a mosaic of grasslands, marshes, woodlands, and standing water. A place capable of sustaining not only game animals and plant life, but small groups of humans. This is not just theoretical. Archaeological work in sites like Gamahana Hill, located on the southern margin of the basin, has uncovered compelling traces of early Homo sapiens activity. Excavations there have revealed hearths, burned ostrich eggshell fragments, and stone tools that date back to roughly 150,000 years ago. More than that, the site contains fragments of calcite crystals that appear to have been deliberately collected and transported. These are not utilitarian objects. They do not cut or scrape or pound, but they shine. Their surfaces catch the light, and in a dark shelter lit by flame they would have glowed. There is no way to know what these crystals meant to the people who gathered them. Perhaps they were admired for their beauty, or used in ritual, or simply kept as curiosities. But their presence hints at symbolic behaviour, at a way of seeing the world that goes beyond mere survival. And the fact that this happened far from any known centre of innovation forces us to reconsider how we define centre at all. In parallel, genetic studies have begun to highlight the importance of southern African populations in the broader Homo sapiens family tree. Modern Khoisan-speaking peoples who live in and around the Kalahari today carry some of the most ancient genetic lineages ever identified. Their DNA diverged from other Homo sapiens groups more than 200,000 years ago, suggesting that their ancestors were already distinct and possibly isolated when our species was still young. This does not mean that today's Khoisan communities are living fossils or unchanged relics of the past. No one is. All human cultures evolve, but it does mean that the roots of their lineage stretch deep into the interior, and that the populations who once lived here were not peripheral. They were foundational. The combination of genetics, archaeology, and paleoclimate research points to a model in which early Homo sapiens were not clustered in a single region, but scattered across diverse ecological zones. Some of them coastal, yes, but others tucked deep within the continental interior. In the Kalahari, these early humans would have experienced both abundance and scarcity, both wet and dry cycles, in patterns shaped by long-term climatic rhythms. And in these cycles they would have adapted. What does adaptation look like in this context? Not dramatic changes in tool form or anatomy, but subtle shifts in mobility, in foraging strategy, in social behaviour. When freshwater lakes dried into salt pans, people would have moved. When rains returned, they would have returned as well. These movements may have reinforced social bonds or created new ones. They may have fostered systems of knowledge, memory of where water could be found, how long it would last, what plants could be eaten after fire or drought. And in long-term isolation, traits could drift. Genetic variants, neutral or beneficial, might rise in frequency simply because populations were small and scattered. Over tens of thousands of years, these isolated lineages would become distinct, genetically, culturally, perhaps even linguistically. And when ecological corridors opened again, these groups might reconnect, exchanging genes and ideas, enriching the diversity of Homo sapiens as a whole. This pattern of fission and fusion, separation and reunion, is a powerful engine of evolutionary change, and it fits well with the braided stream model of human origins, in which our species did not emerge from one population in one place, but from multiple interconnected populations that shared and reshaped each other over time. It also helps explain why the archaeological record is so patchy. Inland sites, especially in arid regions, are harder to find and harder to preserve. Water, after all, is both giver and destroyer of evidence. It can bury, but it can also erode. And many of the most promising locations lie beneath thick layers of sand or deep sediment, where excavation is slow and difficult. Yet even with limited data, a consistent picture is forming. Inland southern Africa, and especially the Kalahari Basin, was not a void between coastal hubs. It was a dynamic region in its own right, one with its own rhythms, innovations and histories. One where early Homo sapiens lived not as wanderers passing through, but as residents who knew the land and returned to it across generations. This matters for how we understand ourselves, because the narrative of human origins has often been drawn around the edges, the dramatic sites, the coastal migrations, the places where symbolic artifacts catch the spotlight. But if we look only at the margins, we miss the middle. We miss the people who adapted in place, who made fire under stars, who stored knowledge and stories we will never hear. There are haunting implications here. If some of the earliest Homo sapiens lived in the Kalahari, and their descendants stayed there for tens of thousands of years, what did they know that we have lost? What ways of seeing, moving, organising life were born in those inland shelters and vanished before they could be etched into stone? We may never know, but the landscape whispers, in the burnt shells of eggs, in the crystals placed beside hearths. In the old lake beds, now dry and cracked but still holding the memory of water. And so we ask again, could our deepest roots be buried far from the coasts? The evidence, as humbly as we can say it, leans toward yes. And if so, then the centre of our story is not where the waves crash or the cliffs fall. It is where silence holds, where the stars still look the same, where humans lived long before we wrote ourselves down, and where, if we listen carefully, the past still breathes. How do you walk into a desert and find hippos? It is not a riddle, it is a paleoclimate problem, a geographic illusion, and a quiet correction to our assumptions about where humans could go, and when. Because what we now call the Arabian Peninsula, with its immense deserts and bleached escarpments, was not always an expanse of heat and absence. There were times, deep in the past, when that entire landscape pulsed with water. And in those moments, early Homo sapiens walked paths now covered in sand, left behind bones now preserved in lake beds, and paused beside fresh water that no longer exists. To understand these forgotten crossings, we have to unlearn the map in our heads and look instead at a region that flickered between extremes, a land that held the memory of both desert and savanna, and at the right time offered a corridor out of Africa not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Begin in the middle of what is now Saudi Arabia, not near the coasts, not in the Fertile Crescent, but deeper in a place called Wusta, where archaeologists found something so improbable that it seemed at first like a mistake. A single human bone, a middle finger phalanx just over 3 centimetres long. It was found in sediments that also held hippopotamus teeth, freshwater snails, and more than 800 bones of large mammals, all clustered around what used to be a lake. This was not a trickle, not an oasis, but a wide body of water fed by monsoons that swept up from the Indian Ocean in long, rhythmic pulses. And that finger bone, which belonged unmistakably to a Homo sapiens, was dated to around 185,000 years ago. It was fossilised, yes, but human beyond doubt. The bone's significance cannot be overstated. Until recently, the Arabian Peninsula was largely left out of discussions about early Homo sapiens movement. It was assumed to be a barrier, too dry, too harsh, too vast. But the sediments at Wusta tell another story. They show a time when the Rub al-Khali, now the largest continuous sand desert on Earth, held grasslands, lakes and animals typically associated with wet savannas, hippos, elephants, giant bovids. They would not have migrated into a dead zone. They were following water, and so were humans. To understand how Arabia turned green, we have to look at the Earth's orbit, specifically the way it wobbles over cycles of about 100,000 years. These orbital shifts, called Milankovitch cycles, change the amount and intensity of sunlight reaching different parts of the planet. And when the summer sun shines stronger in the northern hemisphere, the African monsoon intensifies. Rainfalls move farther north, bringing water to places that today seem unimaginable. During these climate windows, Arabia became a patchwork of lakes, rivers and grasslands, and Homo sapiens, already emerging across eastern Africa, and perhaps even southern regions, followed the green. Wusta is not the only clue. Farther to the east, at a site called Jebel Faya in the United Arab Emirates, archaeologists found stone tools that pushed the timeline of human presence in Arabia even further back. One of the assemblages, known as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, includes flaked points and scrapers that some researchers argue resemble Middle Stone Age African technologies. The layers in which these tools were found are difficult to date precisely, but they likely fall within the range of 125,000 to 170,000 years ago. If so, they may represent another early wave of Homo sapiens moving into the region during a favourable climate phase. But again, it is not just about dates, it is about pattern. The archaeological signatures across these sites show more than a fluke migration. They suggest repeated entries into the peninsula, made possible not by technological breakthroughs, but by environmental ones. The land itself opened, the water returned, and when it did, people followed. Further south, in the Dofa Mountains of Oman, yet another layer of this story has emerged. In caves and open-air sites nestled along ancient river channels, researchers have found Middle Paleolithic tools, again suggesting that humans moved not just along the coasts, but inland, across plateaus, and into river valleys now dry. These tools, shaped from local stone, show that early Homo sapiens were not just passing through. They were adapting, living, staying, if only for a while. What is remarkable is how silent these movements were. No monumental art, no grand burials, just tools, hearths, footprints etched in lakebed sediments. But these quiet signatures speak volumes. They tell us that humans were not waiting for some cultural spark to leave Africa. They were moving when they could, where they could, responding not to ambition, but to opportunity. When the rains came, they stepped forward. When the grass grew, they followed the animals. And when the lakes dried, they likely retreated, or perished, or were folded into the silence of unpreserved time. It is tempting to ask what they thought as they moved. Did they understand they were leaving something behind? Did they know they were in a new place? Or did the trees and birds and smells feel familiar enough to blur the edges? These are not questions archaeology can answer. But the rhythm of the record, the way these occupation layers appear, then vanish, hints at a way of life shaped not by conquest, but by season. Some scientists have called these movements pulses, not migrations in the modern sense with intent and destination, but expansions that surged and faded with the climate. The monsoon brought them forward, the drought drove them back, and in the brief windows when Arabia bloomed, it became not a corridor, but a world of its own, fertile, rich, and alive with things now buried. One of the more haunting aspects of this story is how completely it vanished. Today, the Wusta lake bed is dry. The bones were preserved because the sediments compacted and hardened. The tools were buried under wind-blown dust, and for tens of thousands of years, no one suspected that a lush, hippo-filled Arabia had ever existed. It was only through a convergence of technologies, satellite imaging, paleoecology, isotopic dating, that the map began to shift, and so the image sharpens. Not a great march out of Africa in a single wave, but a series of exploratory ripples each tied to rain, to water, to cycles written into the tilt of the earth itself. These humans were not just testing boundaries. They were following green lifelines across a continent and beyond. But these early Arabian populations, like others of their time, seem to have left no direct genetic trail. Their descendants did not fill the world. They did not replace Neanderthals. Their tools do not show dramatic leaps in innovation. But they mattered, because they show that Homo sapiens was never confined to a single path. They show that movement and return were part of our rhythm from the beginning, that we explored, not because we had to, but because we could. And then, as always, the climate shifted again. The lakes shrank, the grass withered, the corridor closed. Arabia hardened into silence, and the hippos vanished. We are left with bones and tools, with sediments and dates, with a phalanx 3 centimetres long, buried for almost 200,000 years, and with the echo of footsteps in places where no human should have been, if we only looked at today's map. So we ask once more, how do you walk into a desert and find hippos? The answer, for a time, was simple. You did not walk into a desert. You walked into a green world that no longer exists, a world that remembered water, a world that opened just long enough to be walked, lived, and forgotten. Until now. Why bury your dead if you won't be remembered? The act seems simple at first glance. A body laid in a pit, a scatter of stones, perhaps a red stain in the soil. But nothing in early human life was simple, and nothing in early human death was either. Because sometime between 120,000 and 90,000 years ago, in a region that today stretches across northern Israel, someone made a choice. They took the body of a young adolescent, tucked it into the soft floor of a cave and placed deer antlers across the hands and chest. Then they covered it all with sediment and left it there. Not for practical reasons, not to hide it from predators, but because it meant something. And whatever that meaning was, it left an echo. One we can still feel today in the limestone hollows of Skhul and Qafzeh. These two caves, perched in the hills of Mount Carmel and the Lower Galilee, were never palaces. They were dark, damp, and riddled with animal bones. But they were homes, and more than that, they were among the first places where the lines between life and death were drawn with care. The remains found here, a mix of adults and children, show signs of deliberate burial. Skeletons curled in fetal positions, graves dug and refilled, ochre powder scattered across bones, and small objects placed where no purely survival-based logic can fully explain them. Begin with Qafzeh Cave. Inside, archaeologists uncovered the skeletal remains of at least 15 individuals, ranging in age from infants to fully grown adults. One of the most striking was Qafzeh 11, a young person, probably an adolescent, who had been laid to rest with those antlers. The positioning was not random. The hands were placed on the chest. The antlers lay directly above them, as if cradled. It is a scene frozen in sediment, so delicate that even the space between the ribs held meaning. What makes this burial especially important is not just its age, though that alone is astounding. At roughly 92,000 years old, it is among the earliest clear examples of symbolic treatment of the dead. But more than that, it is the care, the pattern, the decision to add something unnecessary. Deer antlers are not food. They are not tools. They are visual, tactile, iconic. Their inclusion suggests that even at this early time, Homo sapiens was already developing a relationship to death that went beyond the functional. They were already telling stories with objects, even if those stories have long since crumbled to dust. The same cave yielded other signs of thoughtfulness. Nearby, archaeologists found several perforated shells, glycymerous bivalves, that had likely been strung together as necklaces or pendants. These shells did not come from the cave. They came from the Mediterranean coast, some 35 kilometres away, and some had faint traces of red ochre on them, suggesting they were tinted, perhaps worn, and then left behind. None of this was necessary for survival, but all of it was necessary for something else, something inward, something social, something symbolic. Over at Skhul Cave, the story continues. Dated slightly earlier to around 115,000 years ago, this site contained at least 10 individuals, also buried in shallow pits, some stained with ochre. One adult was found with a mandible, possibly a symbolic object, placed near the head. Others were found in what appear to be family clusters. Again, there was no sign of a struggle. These were not bodies discarded. They were people remembered, if only briefly. And here the mystery deepens, because the tools found at Skhul and Qafzeh were not radically different from those made by their close cousins. The stone flakes, side scrapers, and points are all Middle Paleolithic, functional, flint-based, and efficient. They resemble the Mousterian industry typically associated with Neanderthals, which suggests something unexpected, that these early Homo sapiens, so capable of symbolic behaviour, were using technologies similar to those of other human species, and perhaps more importantly that the capacity for symbolic thought cannot be read from a toolkit alone. The presence of ochre is especially striking. This red mineral pigment, used across prehistoric sites for everything from body paint to cave art, shows up here as early as 100,000 years ago. In Qafzeh Cave, large chunks of ochre were found alongside the burials, some with signs of grinding. It is hard to imagine this as anything but intentional. Ochre does not form in caves. It must be collected, prepared, and brought in. Which means someone thought the effort was worth it. For colour, for ritual, for reasons we can only infer. But as with so much in early human history, this story has a sharp edge, because the people of Skhul and Qafzeh left no genetic descendants. Their line ended. Their caves were later reoccupied by Neanderthals, and for all their symbolic acts, their burial traditions, their shell necklaces, they are not the ancestors of modern humans alive today. They are a vanished experiment, a cultural flicker that did not continue, a thread that snapped in the weave of time, and yet what they left behind matters, because it forces us to rethink what it means to be human, not in the sense of survival or anatomy, but in the quiet ways we shape meaning. To bury a child with antlers, to gather shells from a distant coast, to grind ochre into powder and smear it across the bones. These are not strategies, they are signals. They tell us that even this early Homo sapiens had begun to live in a world layered with abstraction. That our ancestors, or at least our cousins, were already speaking a language made of gesture, colour and form. Some researchers have argued that this behaviour implies religion, or at least the stirrings of spiritual thought. Others are more cautious, noting that symbolic objects can arise from many contexts: identity, group cohesion, grief. But what remains unarguable is that the people of Skhul and Qafzeh were doing something beyond the pragmatic. They were doing something we still do today, marking the end of life with meaning. The surrounding landscape at the time would have supported this kind of complexity. The fauna preserved in the caves includes gazelle, deer, cattle, and even rhinoceros. This was not a barren wasteland. It was a rich, mixed environment with grasslands, woodlands, and coastlines within reach. Resources were plentiful enough to allow time for reflection, and reflection, it seems, led to ritual. One haunting possibility is that the symbolism seen here developed not in isolation, but in response to something else: cultural competition, the presence of other hominin groups nearby, a need to distinguish identity, to forge bonds. We cannot prove this. But the overlap in time between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens' presence in the Levant leaves room for speculation. Did the burials intensify as encounters increased? Did the beads and ochre carry meanings of belonging, of territory, of memory? It is a theme that recurs throughout our history. That meaning often arises in tension. That identity crystallizes in contact zones. And here, on the edge of Africa, in a narrow stretch of land that has always served as a bridge between continents, we find perhaps the earliest evidence that humans were more than toolmakers. They were storytellers, even if their stories are now silent. And that brings us back to the question, why bury your dead if you won't be remembered? Maybe the answer is not about memory, maybe it is about grief, or about honouring a life even if no one else ever knows. Maybe it is about the act itself, the motion of placing, the weight of the antlers, the red of the ochre. Maybe meaning is not always meant to last. Maybe it just needs to exist. Once. Or maybe they hoped we would find them, not us specifically, but someone, some descendant of their species who would look into the cave, brush away the dust and wonder who they were, and in doing so, remember them anyway. What happens when your road out becomes a lake? For most of recent history, we've pictured the Sahara as an obstacle, a harsh wall of sand and silence, a dead zone between worlds, and in many ways, that image isn't wrong. The modern Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth, a place where rivers vanish, where bones bleach in weeks, where even the wind sounds hollow. But it hasn't always been that way. And for much of the past 200,000 years, this desert has done something far stranger than merely keep people out. It's lured them in, fed them, sheltered them. Then, when they tried to leave, it trapped them. Because once upon a time, the Sahara was green. Not metaphorically, not in patches, but fully, richly, astonishingly green. Across vast stretches of what is now dust and rock there were rivers, lakes, woodlands, herds of gazelle and antelope, hippos basking in shallow water, and humans. Humans who walked, hunted, foraged, and likely wondered how long this miracle would last. These were not coastal pioneers or highland recluses. They were inland Africans, thriving in the heart of a continent whose climate pulsed like a breathing lung. To understand how, we have to shift the lens of time, zoom out, not across decades or even millennia, but across climate cycles. Earth's tilt and orbit are not constant. They wobble, subtly but profoundly over tens of thousands of years. These cycles, known as Milankovitch cycles, change how much sunlight reaches different parts of the planet. And when the northern hemisphere tilts just right, the African monsoon strengthens. Rain falls deeper into the continent. The deserts bloom. This is the origin of the so-called Green Sahara periods, intervals lasting several thousand years when rainfall transforms the desert into a mosaic of lakes, wetlands, and savannas. These were not just brief interruptions, they were fully functional ecosystems, and for Homo sapiens they offered something that much of the rest of Africa could not: a corridor. A Across the Sahara, these wet phases created vast networks of river channels, now buried beneath sand, that connected Central Africa to the Mediterranean world. These rivers are detectable today through satellite imagery and geophysical surveys. They show up as fossil riverbeds, long-forgotten arteries of life. Some fed into giant paleolakes, such as Lake Megachad in what is now the southern Sahara. At its peak, this single lake was larger than the modern Caspian Sea, a true inland sea, teeming with fish, crocodiles and birds. Surrounding it, grasslands stretched for hundreds of kilometres. In this context, Homo sapiens moved. Not in a desperate flight from scarcity, but in a confident stride through abundance. Archaeological finds across the Sahara, stone tools, animal bones, hearths, attest to human presence during these green phases. Sites like the Caucasus Mountains in Libya, the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒 Plateau, and the Aya Massif preserve signs of early occupation, from hunting camps to seasonal shelters. In Niger, at Gobero, skeletons of early humans lie buried in once fertile lake margins, their bones curled in peaceful repose beneath ancient sediments. These were not survivors clinging to the edge. They were people living in a place that felt, at least for a while, like home. But this is where the trap begins, because the Sahara's green phases do not last. As orbital parameters shift, rainfall retreats. The monsoons weaken, lakes shrink and then vanish. Forests burn, grasslands turn to scrub and scrub to sand. The people living in these once lush corridors are not immediately expelled, but they are slowly stranded. Rivers that once offered passage become barriers again. Waterholes dry up, migrations stall, isolation creeps in. This oscillation, from habitable corridor to impassable desert, plays out across multiple waves of human history, and it complicates any narrative of a linear out-of-Africa movement. Because for tens of thousands of years, the Sahara wasn't just a border to cross. It was a place to live, a place to expand into, and then a place to become stuck. Some researchers refer to this as the Saharan pump hypothesis. The idea is that during wet periods, human populations expand northward through the Sahara, reaching into areas that connect with the Mediterranean and beyond. But when the climate dries, those populations contract, either retreating south or becoming fragmented and stranded. This cyclical pattern may help explain the patchy and seemingly failed nature of early human dispersals beyond Africa. Every time the door opened, it promised a new chapter, and every time it closed, it ended that chapter before it could be written in full. Genetic studies support the idea of repeated isolation. Modern African populations bear the signatures of deep ancestral splits and recombinations. Some of this may reflect groups separated by deserts and reunited during green windows. The long gaps in genetic exchange could be measured not just in generations, but in the entire climate phases, stretches of 10 to 20,000 years. In this way, the Sahara becomes not just a physical filter, but a genetic one, a landscape that shapes the very structure of our species by allowing only certain combinations of people to meet, and only during certain times. But the archaeological record still leaves gaps. We know of tool types, Middle Stone Age industries, spread across northern and central Africa during green phases, but we lack clear fossil evidence to tie these tools to specific human lineages. Were these tool makers the same Homo sapiens who left bones at Jebel Irhoud and Omo Kibish? Or were they part of yet unidentified populations, cousins or even siblings in our evolutionary tree? The tools do not speak. They simply lie in the sand, waiting for context we may never fully recover. One striking find comes from Wadi Tanazoufd in southern Algeria. Here, stone artifacts and cut-marked animal bones suggest organised hunting and butchery activity around what was once a lake. Faunal remains include large ungulates, evidence of a productive grassland environment. But today, that site is in one of the driest regions of the Sahara. The transformation is total, and it reminds us how misleading modern landscapes can be when imagining the past. A place that feels utterly alien now may once have been familiar, even comfortable. This is perhaps the greatest challenge in reconstructing early human movement. The Sahara does not preserve its gifts well. When the rain retreats, it takes the sediment with it. Organic remains decay. Lake beds become dust basins. Without careful stratigraphy and precise dating, most evidence vanishes, which is why each discovery feels like an accident, a rare glimpse through a rapidly closing window. But those windows, when they do appear, shift the story. They remind us that Homo sapiens was not a species waiting in stasis until the stars aligned. We were mobile, curious, ecologically flexible. We followed rains, we fished lakes, we walked through grasslands that no longer exist, and in doing so, we reached the edges of the continent long before the textbook migration ever began. The haunting part is how often those expansions led nowhere. Time and again, groups that ventured northward into the Sahara vanished from the record. Not in a single catastrophe, but in a slow fade. No genetic legacy, no cultural continuity, just the stone tools, the burial sites, the dry footprints of a life once lived. And then silence. We often ask where the first humans came from, but maybe an equally important question is, what kept them in? What landscapes opened their arms, only to fold them again? The Sahara, in this light, is not just a setting. It is a character, a shapeshifter, a gatekeeper, sometimes a cradle, sometimes a grave. And that leaves us with the image of a traveller, some 120,000 years ago, standing at the edge of a great lake where now there is only sand. They would have seen reeds, birds, fish flickering near the shore. The sun reflected not off stone but off water, and maybe, in the back of their mind, they wondered how long it would last. Maybe they remembered stories from grandparents about dry years. Maybe they packed a light, thinking they would move again soon. They could not have known that the lake would disappear, that the river would stop, that the corridor they followed would close behind them like a trap. And yet, they walked anyway, because that is what we have always done, not blindly, but hopefully. 1 foot forward into a world we cannot predict. And so we ask again, what happens when your road out becomes a lake? Maybe you stop, maybe you settle, maybe you thrive for a while, or maybe you vanish, and wait to be rediscovered one day by another walker, another dreamer following the same path, only backwards. Did we reach the edge of the world and just vanish? Somewhere in the thick green mountains of southern China, inside a humid cave that breathes mist with the seasons, a set of small human teeth lay untouched for over 100,000 years. They were never meant to be found, not buried in a ritual, not kept in a pouch, not decorated or preserved in any special way, just scattered gently in the limestone dust of Fuyun Cave. And yet their discovery rewrote one of the quietest chapters in human history, because the teeth did not belong to Neanderthals or Denisovans or archaic ghosts. They were ours, the unmistakable shape of Homo sapiens, modern humans, tens of thousands of years before we were supposed to be there. It is one thing to find a fossil in the expected place, at the expected time. It is another to find it hundreds of kilometres deeper into the continent, dated tens of millennia earlier than models had allowed. The Fuyun Cave teeth were first excavated in the early 2010s from a layer of sediment buried under stalagmite growth. There were 47 of them in total, human but scattered across the cave floor among animal remains and mineral debris. Their context was messy, but the dating was clear. The flowstone that sealed them was at least 80,000 years old, which meant the teeth beneath had to be older. Most researchers now place them somewhere between 120,000 and 100,000 years before the present. At the time of publication, this made them the oldest anatomically modern human fossils in East Asia. But as with all good scientific surprises, controversy followed immediately, because the teeth, though unmistakably modern, were found without a skull, without tools, without any of the cultural signatures we like to associate with our species. Could they have been intrusive? Was the dating wrong? Were these perhaps another hominin mimicking our dental traits? Skeptics pointed out that without clearer stratigraphy or additional bones, caution was warranted. But over time, the evidence accumulated. Morphometric analysis confirmed the teeth matched modern human populations. Their enamel thickness, root structure, and crown shapes were more gracile than those of Neanderthals or Denisovans. And crucially, no traits characteristic of archaic humans in Asia, such as robust molars or shovel-shaped incisors, were present. Whoever left these teeth behind was one of us. And this was not an isolated incident. In Jirandong, another cave further south, a partial mandible with 2 teeth was discovered and dated to around 100,000 years ago. The jaw was more fragmentary than the Fuyun set. but it too displayed a mixture of modern and archaic traits, a chin beginning to emerge, smaller molars, more delicate proportions. These are not the kinds of fossils that draw headlines. They are not skeletons in dramatic repose. They are small, broken, and contentious. But together they sketch the outline of a vanished population, Homo sapiens who reached the misty forests of southern China tens of millennia before the great dispersal that populated the rest of the world. What were we doing there? The terrain of southern China is a patchwork of limestone hills, forested ridges, and deep, wet caves. It is not the easiest place to live, nor the easiest to excavate. The climate is harsh on organic remains. Bones rot, layers shift. But caves like Fuyan and Jirendong offer one advantage: shelter from time. Their internal temperatures remain stable. Dripping stalactites create carbonate seals that slow the destruction of anything trapped beneath them. This is why, despite the difficulties, these caves have preserved some of the oldest glimpses of human presence in East Asia. But presence alone is not enough. The real question is whether these early humans thrived, or merely passed through. At present, there is no direct evidence that the populations represented by the Fuyan or Jirendong teeth contributed to later Asian groups. No genetic continuity has been confirmed. No cultural traditions trace back to them. They appear in the record, unannounced, and then disappear, as if they reached the edge of the world and then stepped off. This has led many researchers to frame these early East Asian sapiens as another failed migration, a pulse, a wandering branch. Perhaps a small group followed rivers or coastlines, driven by climate or prey, and made it into what is now China during a particularly hospitable window. They settled in caves, lived off the land, left almost nothing behind. And then, when the climate shifted or the ecology changed, they died out. Not with a bang, but with a quiet fade. A lost branch on the tree that bloomed too early. But even that metaphor may be too simple, because their presence forces us to reconsider how fast, how early, and how widespread Homo sapiens really were. If modern humans were living in southern China over 100,000 years ago, that implies not just presence, but adaptation. These weren't tropical wanderers lost in the hills. They were functional, surviving, breeding. They found water. They found food. And for a time, they made it work. It also suggests that coastal routes long theorized but difficult to prove may have played a key role in these early dispersals. The so-called southern dispersal hypothesis proposes that some Homo sapiens followed the rim of the Indian Ocean, moving from the Horn of Africa through Arabia, then skirting the coasts of the Indian subcontinent, and eventually reaching Southeast Asia and beyond. This path would have taken advantage of interglacial sea levels, monsoon-enhanced rainfall, and abundant marine resources. But the archaeological record along these routes is spotty. Sea levels have since risen, burying ancient coastlines underwater, and much of the migration would have left ephemeral traces: shellfish middens, bamboo tools, footprints in sand, none of which preserve well over 100,000 years. In this context, caves like Fuyan and Jirendong become precious, not just for their fossils, but for what their mere existence implies: that humans had reached these far eastern latitudes at a time when the rest of the world still seemed quiet. And they had done so, perhaps, by a route that we may never fully reconstruct. One mystery that lingers is the apparent absence of stone tools at Fuyan Cave. Unlike other Middle Paleolithic sites, where 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐴 flakes or core tools provide cultural anchors, the Fuyan assemblage lacks clear lithic evidence. Some speculate that the tools used here were perishable: bamboo knives, wooden spears, fibre nets, all lost to decay. Others suggest the humans here were part of a minimalist foraging strategy, relying more on scavenging or trapping than on tool-based hunting. But without artifacts, this remains a guess. It also raises the possibility that our search images are biased. We often look for ourselves in fire, in blade, in burial. But what if some Homo sapiens lived without those markers? What if some of our ancestors were simply quiet? Still, the silence is not total. In the nearby cave of Luna, thousands of animal bones, including deer and pig, have been found in layers overlapping with the presumed occupation range of early humans. Some show cut marks, some are burnt. It is not definitive proof of hunting or cooking, but it suggests that these caves were active sites, places of life and death. If the humans of Fuyan left no stone tools, they may have left meals instead. and we must remember that the cave floor is not a museum. It is a living layer, disturbed by time, sediment, animals, and tectonics. Girardon offers slightly more clarity. The jaw fragment found there is thought to belong to a robust adult, possibly male, who lived in a warm, forested environment near the modern Guangxi border. The layer in which it was found also contained animal bones and a few coarse tools, though not enough to reconstruct a full toolkit. Like Fuyan, the site suggests habitation, but not permanence. These were not village founders or empire builders, they were wanderers, and then nothing. After 100,000 years ago, the trail goes cold. The next confirmed modern human fossils in China do not appear until around 40,000 years ago, 80,000 years later. And by then, the landscape has changed. The newcomers carry different toolkits, show different morphologies, and may belong to the wave of Homo sapiens that left Africa around 70,000 years ago and succeeded where the earlier ones failed. The Fuyan group, the Girardon individual, they left no known descendants. But maybe that is the wrong measure of success. Maybe it is enough that they were there, that they saw the mists of the Guangxi hills, that they tasted the fish of the river, that they left a tooth or two behind and vanished. Maybe not all stories need to lead somewhere. Some exist just to remind us that the world was always bigger than we thought, that humans have always pushed beyond the map, and if we follow that thread far enough, a question begins to form, not about migration or ancestry, but about the nature of human presence itself. What does it mean that Homo sapiens reached the edge of East Asia so early and disappeared so completely? Are we looking at extinction, isolation, absorption by other hominin groups whose bones we have yet to find? Or are we simply looking at a blind spot, a hole in the record that will one day be filled, because caves are patient and the earth forgets slowly? There may be more teeth, more bones, more silent proof of early humans waiting under the hills, and perhaps one day someone will find a mandible that changes everything, a child's skull, a hearth, a tool pressed into the mud of a river long vanished. Until then, all we have are the teeth, and the mist, and the quiet echo of a question. Did we reach the edge of the world and simply turn back? Can one fossil finger rewrite a continent's history? In a parched corner of the Arabian Peninsula, where wind carves silence across the desert, and not even the horizon seems to move, a small bone lay hidden under lakebed sediment for nearly 90,000 years. It is an ordinary-looking thing, beige, curved, just over 3 centimetres long. If you were walking past it today, you'd mistake it for a bird's fragment, or maybe a misplaced toe from some forgotten ungulate, but in the right hands and under the microscope of modern paleoanthropology, it is a miracle. Because this unremarkable digit from Wusta is the oldest known Homo sapiens fossil in Arabia, and that finger quietly curled in the soil is still pointing east. For decades, the Arabian Peninsula was treated like a blank space in the human story, a giant, inhospitable land bridge between the meaningful parts of our journey. It was dry, vast, and seemingly lifeless. Most researchers assumed that early humans either went around it or crossed quickly without leaving much behind. But that assumption, like many in the study of deep time, was based on absence. The absence of bones, the absence of hearths, the absence of any sign that someone had lived here long enough to leave a trace. Then came the site of Wusta. Located in the Nefer Desert of northwestern Saudi Arabia, the area today appears utterly unlivable. Red dunes, high heat, barely a trace of surface water. But it wasn't always this way. Around 90,000 years ago, this desert was a green savanna. It held lakes, grasses, hippos, and gazelles. It was for a time a continuation of the African ecosystem, not its opposite. And that is what drew people here. The Wusta excavation began in the early 2010s as part of a broader push to re-examine neglected zones in early human dispersal. And what they found surprised everyone. In addition to the now famous finger bone, the site contained stone tools, cut-marked animal bones, and sedimentary evidence of an ancient freshwater lake. This wasn't just a campsite, it was a fully functioning environment, a place where humans could survive for generations. The people who came here weren't racing across Arabia, they were living in it. Now, about that finger. It is officially known as AW1, and it is a proximal phalanx from the middle finger of a modern human. The shape is unmistakable, curved but not robust, with proportions matching that of Homo sapiens. It is not Neanderthal. It is not archaic, and crucially, its size and geometry rule out every other known hominin. Using uranium series dating and electron spin resonance, researchers placed the bone at roughly 85 to 90,000 years old. That makes it the earliest confirmed presence of our species in the heart of Arabia by tens of thousands of years. It is worth pausing to consider how rare this is. Fossils from this time period are scarce everywhere. Fossils from this time period in Arabia are practically non-existent. Yet here, at the ancient edge of a lake, someone left their finger behind. Perhaps they died nearby. Perhaps scavengers scattered their remains. Perhaps the rest of the skeleton lies just a few meters deeper, still waiting. But even this one piece is enough to reshape our understanding of early human dispersal. Because this is not the out-of-Africa migration that gave rise to the global populations of today. That comes later, between 70 and 50,000 years ago. This is earlier. This is different. This is evidence of another pulse, another wave, one that left Africa before the world was ready to remember it. The Wusta site, in addition to the fossil, yielded over 300 stone tools. Most are classified as Middle Paleolithic, made from locally sourced chert, shaped by a simple but effective reduction sequence. There are flakes, points, and scrapers, consistent with hunting and butchering. They suggest not just transient movement, but actual ecological adaptation. Whoever lived here knew what they were doing. Even more striking is the faunal assemblage. The bones of animals found at Wusta read like a checklist of wetland Africa: hippos, oryx, wild cattle. Some bones showed clear signs of human modification, cut marks on long bones, percussion fractures consistent with marrow extraction. These are not casual leftovers. They're evidence of processing, of nutritional strategy, and they place Homo sapiens in direct interaction with a rich, complex ecosystem that no longer exists. The real power of Wusta lies in what it implies. Not just that early humans reached Arabia, that part is now widely accepted, but that they did so during climate windows that made the impossible possible. During the late Pleistocene, monsoon patterns shifted periodically due to orbital cycles, particularly the precession of Earth's axis. These shifts, which happen roughly every 20 to 23,000 years, altered the reach of the Indian Ocean monsoon, bringing rainfall northward into the Arabian interior. When that happened, deserts transformed. Ephemeral lakes appeared. Rivers flowed. The land turned green. These so-called Green Arabia phases are now known to have occurred repeatedly throughout the Pleistocene. They created corridors, not in the modern sense of roads, but in the ecological sense. Strings of habitable zones that early humans could follow, and crucially, these were not narrow highways. They were broad, diffuse pathways, scattered oases and valleys, sometimes hundreds of kilometers across, that opened and closed depending on rainfall and vegetation. If you were a hominin moving on foot, following herds or rivers, this mattered more than any map. Wusta, it seems, was one of the stops along such a corridor, a lakeside habitat that appeared during one of these greening phases and offered just enough water, prey and shelter for a small population to establish itself, at least for a while. But of course it didn't last. The climate shifted again, rain retreated, the lakes dried, and the corridor collapsed. The humans of Wusta either moved on, or didn't. We don't know if they died out locally, or if their descendants retreated back to Africa, or if they kept walking and were absorbed by later populations. What we do know is that their genetic legacy, as far as we can tell, did not survive. The people of Wusta are not the ancestors of modern Arabs, or of anyone else living today. They are part of a chapter that ended, a branch that was pruned, and yet, in a way, they are still with us, because they prove something simple and quietly revolutionary, that Homo sapiens did not need to wait for the perfect moment to expand. We tried, again and again, even when we failed. We took risks. We walked into deserts. We followed the rains, and sometimes we guessed wrong. But that is what makes us human. Wusta is a reminder that not all migrations are successful, but all are significant. There is something oddly poetic about the fact that our first confirmed footprint in Arabia is a single finger. Not a jaw or a skull or a burial, just the part of the hand we use to point, to reach, to say, over there, let's go. It is a gesture frozen in time, still calling us toward the edge of what we know. It also forces us to reconsider how we define success. If you measure by descendants, Wusta was a failure. If you measure by presence, by the simple fact of existence, of survival in a changing world, it was a triumph. For thousands of years, Homo sapiens lived here. They drank from the lake, they hunted gazelle, they sat by the fire under stars no longer visible, and for a while, they made it work. Then the desert came back. Today that lake is gone, the hippos are gone, the grass is gone, but the finger remains, and with it, a question that has no easy answer. How many times did we walk this earth before the world was ready to remember us? Because Wusta is just one site, and the Arabian Peninsula is vast. There may be others, other lakes, other tools, other bones curled into the sediment, waiting for someone to find them, each one a quiet echo of our most persistent instinct, not to settle, not to dominate, but simply to move, to see what lies beyond the next ridge, to point towards something better, and follow it. Maybe we should be grateful that not all migrations succeed. Without the failures we would have no mystery, and without mystery we would have no story. And if the past tells us anything, it's that our story is never finished, not even in the sand. How do you leave no bones, but still leave a trail? It is the kind of question that frustrates archaeologists and tempts storytellers. In the long record of early Homo sapiens wanderings, South Asia stands as both a crucial waypoint and a haunting blank spot. We know we passed through, we are almost certain of it, but for a long time the land withheld its evidence. No skulls, no jaws, no ribs in the red sands, just a ghostly persistence of stone tools, scattered across the subcontinent like the footprints of travellers who never stopped long enough to build a home. The puzzle is not one of absence, but of silence. Southern Asia, particularly the Indian subcontinent, was not empty between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. Far from it. It held rivers, forests, grasslands and coasts. It had the ecological richness to sustain entire populations of hominins. And in fact, there were already humans here long before our species stepped in. Some of the earliest Acheulean tools on the continent may date to over 1 million years ago, likely crafted by Homo erectus. Later, we find Middle Paleolithic artifacts, made with prepared core techniques, flake tools and points. The forms are different. The patterns evolve, and somewhere along this technological trail something changes. But no one left a femur to explain it. In the past few decades, a quiet revolution has unfolded in the archaeology of South Asia. Not because bones have been found, but because archaeologists have learned to read the stones with deeper nuance. In places like the Jwalapuram Plateau in southeastern India, layers of stone tools preserved beneath, within and above volcanic ash deposits offer a rare stratigraphic sequence. And one of those ash layers, in particular, tells a story so extreme that it has been blamed for near extinction. Around 74,000 years ago, a volcano erupted in what is now Sumatra. This eruption, known as the Toba supereruption, was one of the largest in the past 2 million years. Its ash cloud stretched across much of the Indian Ocean basin, blanketing parts of India in several meters of debris. For decades, some researchers believed that this event triggered a global ecological catastrophe, leading to a severe population bottleneck in early Homo sapiens. According to this view, the eruption wiped out most human populations across Asia, leaving only a few survivors in Africa to repopulate the world. It was a dramatic idea, elegant in its simplicity, catastrophic in its implications. But the stones tell a more complicated story. At Jwalapuram, archaeologists found Middle Paleolithic tools both below and above the volcanic ash. The tools before the eruption and those after were strikingly similar. Not identical, but continuous. That suggests that whoever was living in the region when the ash fell did not vanish. They adapted, they endured, and they kept shaping stone in ways consistent with earlier traditions. Does that mean Homo sapiens survived Toba? Or were these tools made by another hominin entirely? Could it have been late surviving Homo erectus? Or some regional archaic human we haven't named yet? Or perhaps, and this is where the story turns inward again, perhaps it was us, but a version of us not yet ready to leave permanent marks. The difficulty in assigning toolmakers to species without fossil remains is one of paleoanthropology's central frustrations. Behaviour does not always leave a skeleton, and technology is not the sole domain of one lineage. What we call the Middle Paleolithic encompasses a range of core flake techniques, including Levallois and discoidal forms, that appear across different hominin species in different regions. Homo neanderthalensis used them in Europe. Homo sapiens used them in Africa. In India, where the fossil record is sparse, the same technologies appear, but without a clear fingerprint. Still, there are signs pointing toward a sapiens presence. In Tamil Nadu, at Attirampakkam, researchers have found tools spanning a vast chronological range, including some older than 300,000 years and others that suggest the continuity of prepared core techniques into the time frame we associate with early modern humans. The site shows not just one technological layer, but multiple transitions, evidence of change, adaptation, persistence. And while the precise identity of the toolmakers remains debated, the dates overlap with our species' known movements. Further north, in the Soan Valley of Pakistan and the Narmada River region of central India, scattered finds add complexity. A partial hominin cranium discovered in the Narmada Valley in the mid-20th century has been variously classified as Homo erectus, an archaic Homo sapiens or something in between. Its morphology resists easy placement, with a mix of primitive and derived traits. The fossil is likely older than the Toba eruption, but it reinforces the idea that India was not empty, and that its populations may have been diverse and evolving in relative isolation, or perhaps even contact. Genetic studies have tried to peer backward into this silence too, and while most agree that the modern populations of South Asia derive from post-70,000-year expansions of Homo sapiens out of Africa, there is some evidence, weak but persistent, of deeper genetic lineages in the region. Small signals, trace admixture, the kind of statistical whispers that suggest the possibility of contact with archaic humans or older dispersals. But nothing definitive. This is what makes South Asia's Paleolithic so frustrating and so fascinating. It sits at the intersection of what we know and what we suspect. It holds the sediments of both continuity and disappearance. In the archaeological layers before the Toba ash, we see behaviours that look increasingly modern, an argument for early Homo sapiens presence, well before the canonical out-of-Africa migration. But without a skeleton, the evidence cannot testify to its maker, so we turn to landscape models. Climatic reconstructions suggest that parts of India would have remained habitable even during the worst phases of volcanic fallout. River systems persisted, forests recovered, and from what the tools suggest, so did people. Perhaps small bands of humans living at low densities moved across these zones, exchanging ideas, changing gradually, until later populations, better equipped, more numerous, would wash over them in waves. Or perhaps these early toolmakers were part of those later waves all along. Perhaps we are wrong to separate them. The distinction between success and failure, migration and extinction, may not be as clean as we imagine. Cultures overlap, populations blend. Sometimes the people change and the tools remain. Other times, the tools change and the people are the same. By the time Homo sapiens clearly appears in the subcontinent's genetic record, around 55 to 65,000 years ago, most of the earlier archaeological traditions seem to have faded. The Upper Paleolithic takes root. Blade technologies emerge. Rock shelters start to show evidence of pigment use, geometric microliths, and later symbolic art. But all of that is still to come. What the Middle Paleolithic of India offers is a kind of murmur, not loud enough to be called a voice, but distinct enough to feel human. A trail made of sharp stones and interrupted ash. A record of survival that says, we were here, we lived through fire. And yet the question remains, if Homo sapiens did reach India before the Toba eruption, why didn't they stay? Was the population too small? Was the ecology too fractured? Did their legacy get absorbed into later waves of migration, lost to the tides of genetics and time? Or have we simply not found them yet? The bones buried under highways, or villages, or riverbanks where no one has thought to look. Paleoanthropology is a science of fragments, of guesses made slowly and with caution. And in India, more than most places, those fragments are still buried deep. But the trail is not cold. It just takes longer to read. So the next time someone asks where Homo sapiens went before the Great Migration, you might tell them this. Sometimes we walked into a continent and left only the stones to remember us. And sometimes that's enough. If a human disappears in the Paleolithic and no bones remain, does their story still exist? This is not a riddle, though it sounds like one. It is a question at the heart of how we reconstruct the deep past especially the parts that left no artifacts, no burials, and no names. In the last 20 years, genetic evidence has begun whispering back to us from caves and bones that do not belong to us. And what it's telling us is strange. It tells us that our ancestors left Africa long before they stayed gone, that they met others, not metaphorically, but biologically, and that even when their bodies vanished, their genes sometimes stayed. The story begins not with a fossil, but with a fragment. In the early 2000s, a team of scientists working in the Altai Mountains of Siberia sequenced the genome of a girl who had died in a cave called Denisova. What they found surprised everyone. This girl was not Homo sapiens. She was something else, now called Denisovan, a sister group to the Neanderthals. But buried deep within her genome was something unexpected, a small percentage of DNA that clearly came from Homo sapiens. Not from the later wave of humans who would eventually replace everyone else, but from a much older population. A group of sapiens who had left Africa long before the major migration, met the Denisovans somewhere in Eurasia, and then vanished again. Except they didn't vanish entirely. A genetic ghost remained, a faint echo. This discovery flipped the script. For decades, the assumption was that modern humans had replaced archaic humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans and others, only after the big migration between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. But now we knew that something else had happened earlier. There had been contact, real, physical, reproductive contact. Not just once, but enough to leave a measurable trace. The Altai Denisovan genome is not the only one carrying these signals. Neanderthal DNA extracted from bones in caves in Europe and Russia show the same pattern. Around 100,000 years ago, maybe slightly earlier, Homo sapiens had made their way into Eurasia. They interbred with Neanderthals in at least one direction. We know this because Neanderthals carry chunks of DNA that closely resemble modern African populations, but that are too old and too degraded to come from the later migration. The direction matters. In this case, it was sapiens DNA entering the Neanderthal genome, not the other way around. These early migrants were not overwhelmed by Neanderthal genes. They were the ones leaving their mark. But those genes do not show up in modern humans. The line of sapiens that contributed to Neanderthals seems to have died out. No one alive today descends from them, except, in a way, we do, indirectly. Because Neanderthals later interbred with the main wave of modern humans. And so, a sliver of that ancient, vanished sapiens genome still lives inside us, but only after passing through another species. This is where things get strange. Normally, we think of ancestry as a straight line, parents to children, generations stacked like bricks. But deep time is more like a river delta. Branches split, eddy, flow back into each other, and sometimes disappear into sand. The sapiens who met the Neanderthals and Denisovans did not become us, but they became part of the others, and then those others became part of us. A kind of evolutionary ricochet. The details are still being pieced together. Geneticists can model population structure using DNA extracted from teeth, bones, and sometimes even sediment. What they've found is that these early interbreeding events were not singular. There were likely multiple episodes of contact. Some happened around 100,000 years ago, others closer to 70,000. Each left a slightly different signature, detectable in the lengths of DNA fragments and the number of recombination events. The shorter the fragment, the older the encounter. In some cases, the genes transferred from sapiens into Neanderthals seem to have provided functional benefits. There is evidence that skin pigmentation, immune response, and even metabolism may have been affected. But it is hard to know. The sample sizes are small, the noise is high, and as always we must tread carefully between what is tempting to believe and what the data actually say. It is very easy to tell a story, much harder to prove one. Still, the implications are staggering. We often think of the past as divided, sapiens over here, Neanderthals over there. But genetics shows us a messier picture, a landscape of interwoven threads, crossing and uncrossing over tens of thousands of years. The fact that we can detect the DNA of humans who left no skeletons, no tools and no names, that is a triumph of modern science. But it is also a reminder of our limitations. These early humans were real. They walked. They ate. They made choices. And yet we know them only as statistical anomalies in the genomes of others. They have no faces, only base pairs. One of the most haunting examples comes from a girl found in the Denisova cave who was, quite literally, half and half. Her mother was a Neanderthal, her father a Denisovan, and yet even within her there were fragments of Homo sapiens DNA, passed down through earlier generations. She was a child of 3 worlds, and yet she belonged to none. Her species does not exist anymore, and neither do the people who gave her those genes. But in that one girl, the entire complexity of our shared evolutionary history is embodied. It is not clean, it is not simple, it is real. So what does this mean for how we understand the human story? First, it means that the old models of replacement and superiority are inadequate. Evolution is not a tournament. It is not survival of the best. It is survival of the lucky, the flexible, the connected. Sometimes a group wins by adapting, sometimes by moving, sometimes just by being in the right place when a volcano doesn't erupt. Second, it shows us that the distinction between sapiens and not sapiens was never absolute. The boundaries were porous. The line between us and them was always blurry and always shifting. We are used to thinking that because we are here, we are the inevitable outcome. But genetics tells a different story, one where our ancestors tried and failed, where they wandered into new lands, met other humans, exchanged genes, and then disappeared. Their legacy is not in bones, but in code, and even that code is fading. Each generation scrambles the signals a little more. Still, the echoes remain, faint but present. In the nuclei of our cells, a whisper from a time when Homo sapiens walked out into a world already inhabited and left only a trace behind. Not a culture, not a tool, just a sequence, a signature without a name. And the question that remains is not just who they were, but what they hoped. Did they think they were going home? Did they know they were the first of us to leave and that they would not be the ones to stay? Or were they simply following the rains, the herds, the coastline, one step at a time? We do not know, but their absence is a presence, and their silence somehow still speaks. What happens when the ones who stayed outlive the ones who arrived? For a long time it was assumed that Homo sapiens slowly pushed out other humans, that we were the ones who crossed borders and replaced everyone else. But the Levant tells a different story. Here, in a corridor of stone and seasonally green valleys between the eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian deserts, the past plays like a loop. In one cave, a modern human jawbone is left behind near a fire. In another, a shell bead, or perhaps a burial. And then the weather changes. The trees thin. And when someone returns, it isn't us. Between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, the Levant was less a route and more a roundabout. A place where humans of different kinds passed through, camped, vanished, and returned. But not always in the same order. In this particular stretch of prehistory, it is not Homo sapiens who inherit the landscape. It is Neanderthals, and what they inherit is not empty land. It is our hearths, our sites, our abandoned thresholds. If the Levant was a door, we opened it first, but they walked back through it when we were gone. In the cave of Tabun, near Mount Carmel in modern-day Israel, archaeologists have been digging for nearly a century. The layers go deep, one of the longest continuous Paleolithic sequences in the world. The lowest levels, known as Layer G, have yielded signs of early human occupation, including flint tools made using the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒 technique. But higher up, in Layer C, the story changes. In the 1930s, a nearly complete skeleton was uncovered here, known today as Tabun 1. She was a Neanderthal woman. Her skull is long and low, her brow ridged and heavy. Her teeth, well worn, and possibly used as tools. Based on the sediment around her and updated dating techniques, she likely lived around 120,000 years ago. What's eerie is that this very cave had already shown signs of prior occupation. Layers beneath contain evidence of fire use, faunal remains, and early Middle Paleolithic tools. Whether those belong to Homo sapiens or their archaic relatives isn't fully certain, but the implication is simple. She was not the first one here. Someone else had come before. Perhaps related to the Misliya cave people who lived just up the mountain tens of thousands of years earlier. Perhaps part of that earlier pulse of Homo sapiens that moved into the Levant and then receded. But whatever their origin, they were gone by the time Tabun 1 made her home in the rocks. The reoccupation of sites like Tabun was not accidental. The Levant offered dependable shelter. karstic caves with natural insulation, often located near water sources and game trails. It's easy to imagine why anyone would return, but the rhythm of who stayed and who left seems more tied to the pulse of the climate than any long-term settlement. This region lay at the boundary of two enormous ecological zones. When global climates were cooler and drier, the deserts expanded and access to the Levant tightened. When things warmed and monsoons shifted, green corridors opened across the Sinai and Arabian Peninsula, inviting Homo sapiens and Neanderthals alike to expand their range. But rarely at the same time. Take Qafzeh Cave, also located on Mount Carmel. It too has a long and stratified record of human presence. Around 60,000 years ago, it was occupied by Neanderthals, as evidenced by the famous 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓 skeleton, a remarkably preserved male torso, complete with a hyoid bone that suggests speech capabilities similar to ours. The toolkits from this time reflect a Mousterian tradition, and the faunal remains show a varied diet: fallow deer, wild boar, even tortoises. But again, beneath these Neanderthal layers lie older deposits. The Mousterian tools here do not conclusively point to Neanderthals or sapiens alone. Both groups use similar techniques. But taken alongside nearby caves, a picture begins to form. Amud Cave, located further north in the Galilee region, continues the pattern. It housed some of the last known Neanderthals in the region. Amud I, a male skeleton discovered in the 1960s, dates to roughly 55,000 years ago. His cranial features are distinct: a long face, prominent brow ridge, and the characteristically robust Neanderthal build. His brain volume was likely larger than the average for Homo sapiens today. But what's most striking is not his anatomy, it's the setting. Once again, Neanderthals are living in a cave that had been used before. Once again, they arrive not as explorers of new territory, but as inheritors of places someone else had briefly called home. There's something poignant about this pattern. We often imagine ourselves as the future, as the ones who outlasted, outsmarted, outmaneuvered. But the story in these caves shows a different chronology. Homo sapiens came, then Neanderthals stayed. The rhythm of settlement, abandonment and reoccupation stretches across tens of thousands of years like a breath. In, out, in again. And while we like to chart migration as arrows on a map, the real movements were pauses, retreats and returns. Sometimes the future turns around. The archaeological record supports this eerie alternation. At Skhul and Qafzeh, not far from these caves, anatomically modern humans buried their dead between 120 and 90,000 years ago. But by 70,000 years ago, their kind were gone from the Levant. In their place, Neanderthals. The change is not marked by fire or war or destruction. It is subtle. Cultural layers shift, tool types evolve, bones appear with different shapes, and slowly one lineage replaces another, not because of a clash, but because of time, weather, and perhaps sheer statistical drift. There's no evidence these Neanderthals were aware of those who came before. They may have seen the old hearths and thought them their own, or not thought of them at all. There is no sign of violence, no obvious disruption in the stratigraphy that would suggest conquest or catastrophe. Just a steady, quiet occupation. A new fire built where another once burned. The same tortoises cracked open with different hands. Could they have met? It's possible. The timelines graze one another, but direct interaction remains unproven. Genetic evidence shows that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals around 60,000 years ago, but where that happened is still debated. If it occurred in the Levant, it would have required overlapping presence. Not impossible, but not guaranteed either. And the caves themselves offer no decisive clues. No dual burials, no hybrid bones, just the slow churn of habitation and abandonment. Ghosts replacing ghosts. What stands out is how long Neanderthals held on here. While Homo sapiens retreated from the Levant during harsher climatic phases, Neanderthals persisted, they adapted, they stayed close to the land. At Tabun, the tool industries show continuity over millennia. At Amud, they buried their dead with care. At Qafzeh, they may have spoken or sung. The myth of Neanderthal brutishness fades quickly when you look closely. What replaces it is something quieter. A people with memory, place and persistence. By the time Homo sapiens returned to the Levant in force around 50,000 years ago, these caves would again see new occupants, but the cycle was already breaking. This time, Homo sapiens would stay, And those Neanderthals, the ones who outlasted the earlier wave of modern humans, they would become the ones replaced. There's something humbling in that reversal. The idea that we were not the inevitable victors, that for tens of thousands of years the story was one of return, not conquest, that we were the visitors, and that sometimes those who came after did not survive as long as those they replaced. The Levant remains a crossroads, not just of geography, but of identity. In its caves we find overlapping footprints, fire ash laid over fire ash, burials beneath older burials, a record not of triumph, but of rotation, a place where memory is stratified, and the past is not a ladder but a circle. Who lived here first? Who came back? Who left no trace? And in the end, who do these caves really belong to? We do not know. We may never know, and that, in itself, is an answer. Did we reach the islands before the ocean remembered? Long before modern maps carved the boundaries of continents and sea lanes, long before boats had names or sails had meaning, it's possible that our kind stepped off the edge of Asia and into a vast, misted archipelago. It's not the story most of us were told. The major expansion of Homo sapiens is usually drawn as a clean line, sweeping out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, skimming the coasts of Arabia and India before curving into Southeast Asia and reaching Australia. That story is real, but it may not be the first, because the deeper we look into the caves and soils of island Southeast Asia, the more we find hints that someone had already been there, someone who looked like us, and then left nothing. The islands of Sumatra and Borneo are often remembered for their jungles, volcanoes and orangutans, but beneath those forests, beneath the ash and leaf litter, some of the earliest signs of human presence on these islands challenge our sense of timing. In Leader Aja Cave in Sumatra, first excavated in the late 1800s and then revisited with modern dating methods, 2 fossil human teeth were found embedded in sediments dated to between 73,000 and 63,000 years ago. Their size, shape, and enamel thickness suggest they belong to anatomically modern Homo sapiens, not to earlier hominins like Homo erectus, who had long vanished from the region. These were our teeth, but no skull, no tools, no settlements, just 2 teeth and a date. The implications were quietly disruptive. If Homo sapiens were in Sumatra over 70,000 years ago, they must have crossed substantial bodies of water. Even during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower and the land masses of Asia extended farther south, there were still wide and deep straits separating the Sunda Shelf from the islands beyond. Crossing into Sumatra or Borneo would not have been accidental. It would have required deliberate movement, possibly by raft, canoe, or some now-forgotten vessel. And if this maritime presence existed, it predates what many researchers long believed was the first major wave of Homo sapiens into the region by at least 10,000 years. Other sites echo this possibility. In Borneo, the Naya cave complex has yielded human skeletal material dating to around 40,000 years ago. But in deeper levels, there are tools and signs of occupation that may go back far earlier. Some charcoal remains and modified stones in these layers hint at a human presence predating the Toba eruption, which occurred roughly 74,000 years ago. That event, an enormous volcanic explosion in Sumatra, covered much of South and Southeast Asia in ash, and has often been linked to population bottlenecks or disruptions. But in places like Naya Cave, the archaeological record shows continuity, not collapse. Whoever was there may have weathered the storm, and still the people themselves are missing. No clear skeletal remains of pre-Toba Homo sapiens have yet been found in these island regions. The teeth in Sumatra stand alone. The DNA of modern island populations shows no unique deep ancestry from an earlier wave, only the genetic signature of later expansions. It's as if the first arrivals vanished entirely. No children, no trace, just a fading set of footprints. This vanishing act raises uncomfortable questions. Were these early Homo sapiens wiped out by the Toba eruption? Did they succumb to disease, competition, or dwindling resources? Or did they simply move on, replaced by later waves of migrants whose genes and tools buried the evidence of those who came first? It's tempting to build stories from the silence, to imagine brave maritime pioneers swept away by catastrophe or absorbed into myth. But we don't have the evidence. All we have is a shadow on the timeline, a brief presence in the archaeological haze, and the possibility that our species reached the islands long before the world was ready to remember it. There's also the challenge of context. While the leader-ager teeth and associated fauna seem solidly dated, their placement in older sediments has made some researchers cautious. It's always possible that the bones slipped down into older layers, or that dating errors skewed the results. And the lack of associated tools makes it difficult to know how these early people lived, what they hunted, or how they built shelter. It's an incomplete picture. But absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, especially when the evidence in question lies buried in tropical soils, prone to acid decay and poor preservation. And so, we come back to the ocean, to the water that both reveals and conceals. The idea that Homo sapiens had maritime capabilities earlier than previously believed is no longer as fringe as it once was. There are now models proposing coastal migration routes, stretching from the Horn of Africa through southern Arabia and India and into Southeast Asia well before 60,000 years ago. If those models are correct, then people didn't just walk across the world. They sailed, drifted, and island-hopped through it. And if early Homo sapiens could reach the shores of Sumatra before the Toba ash fell, they could have reached many places we've yet to discover. But the haunting part is this: they didn't stay. Or if they did, their presence was erased. The archaeological silence between those early hints and the later, well-documented colonization of Australasia is deafening. It's as if someone whispered, and the jungle swallowed the sound. No skeletal remains, no genetics. Just a few teeth and a date too early to fit the dominant story. And maybe, just maybe, a memory in the sea. So we ask again, did we reach the islands before the ocean remembered? And if we did, what does it mean to have touched a shore that left no echo? To cross a sea not once, but twice? First as shadows, then as ancestors? It's a question without a neat answer, but that's the kind we like best. If a hand axe falls in the forest, does it remember who held it? The question sounds whimsical at first, like something muttered during a slow dream. But it's also the question that haunts archaeology at its core. Because more often than not, what we find are not people. We find what they made, the things they chipped from stone, the scars of their labour, the impressions left behind not by flesh or thought, but by pressure, by repetition, by motion. And in some places that is all we find. No bones, no names, no footprints, just the ghost of intention in an edge. From around 200,000 years ago, all the way through to 60,000 years ago, a strange pattern emerges across Africa and into Western and Southern Asia. There are vast tool scatters in places where no hominin remains have ever been uncovered. No teeth, no jaw, no rib fragments. But the tools are unmistakable. Middle Paleolithic cores and flakes. Prepared surfaces struck precisely. Scrapers, points, and blades. Some shaped using the Levallois technique, others reflecting local variants. And while we often associate these with known species, Neanderthals in Eurasia, Homo sapiens in Africa, many sites defy easy assignment, because without bones the tool alone cannot tell you who made it. It only tells you that someone was there. Across the Nile Valley, dozens of open-air scatter sites lie exposed after millennia of erosion. Some flank ancient watercourses that dried long ago, others rest atop dune ridges. They bear no fossils, no shelters, no fire. But the lithic artefacts are abundant, Middle Stone Age flakes interspersed with Acheulean hand axes. At one site in Egypt's western desert, over 3,000 stone tools were recovered from a surface layer dated to roughly 160,000 years ago. There were no burials, no pigments, no bones, yet every tool edge spoke the same language, shaped intentionally, discarded after use, left to weather under a sky that forgot them. Further south, the Lupemban culture of Central Africa spans parts of present-day Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and Angola. Here, elongated lanceolate points appear, exquisitely retouched and hafted onto wooden shafts, or so we assume. Some of these sites are over 100,000 years old. But despite the elegance of the tools and their consistency across regions, the makers remain anonymous. There are no hominin fossils definitively associated with Lupemban assemblages. We can hypothesize that Homo sapiens made them. But we do not know. It is a toolkit without a skeleton. In India, the ambiguity deepens. Hundreds of Paleolithic sites stretch across the subcontinent, from the Soan Valley in the northwest to the Kortalaya Basin in the south. Many exhibit Middle Paleolithic characteristics, and some show apparent continuity, even after the Toba volcanic eruption, around 74,000 years ago. But here too the bodies are missing. The tools were left in river terraces, hill slopes and rock shelters, but not the people who wielded them. Were these populations wiped out, replaced, or simply never fossilized? Did they belong to early Homo sapiens from a failed migration wave, or to late surviving archaic groups? The answer dissolves in dust every time the wind shifts, and this pattern holds even outside Africa and South Asia. In the central highlands of Arabia, especially around Jubba and the Nefud Desert, researchers have uncovered Middle Paleolithic toolkits that suggest prolonged occupation around ancient lake beds. The Al-Nasim and Al-Marat sites, dated between 120,000 and 80,000 years ago, yield flakes, points and cores that resemble both African and Levantine traditions. But again, no hominin fossils have ever been recovered. No footprints, no charred bone, no DNA, just the stones. What complicates the picture further is the persistence of older tool forms alongside newer ones. Acheulean hand axes, long thought to represent an earlier phase of human evolution, sometimes appear mixed into Middle Paleolithic contexts. In the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, this overlap stretches for tens of thousands of years. But did these reflect multiple species coexisting? Or was it cultural memory? A continuation of old methods by newer minds? Without the bones, the debate remains open. Even in regions where we do have hominin fossils, the temptation to overconnect is strong. Archaeologists often assign tool assemblages to particular species based on geographic proximity or presumed timelines. But without direct association, a tool found next to a bone in undisturbed layers, the match is never certain. Tools can be moved by water, disturbed by animals, or passed between populations. The hand that struck the flake might not be the same as the one that dropped it. Still, tools offer something rare. They offer intention. Unlike bones, which are silent about behaviour, a stone tool is behaviour frozen in time. A cut mark on a bone tells you what happened. A hand axe tells you what was planned. Someone knew how to hold a core, how to angle a strike, how to shape a cutting edge. That skill did not emerge randomly. It was taught, watched, practiced. Which means that behind every tool, even the most weathered flake, lies a moment of learning, a moment of memory, a moment of culture. In the absence of fossils, these tools become our primary witnesses. They do not tell us the names of the species who made them. They do not preserve the shape of the cranium or the structure of the foot. But they preserve decision. And in prehistory, that's everything. They show us how hominins moved, clustering around riverbanks, spreading along ridgelines, avoiding dense forest. They show us what raw materials were valued, obsidian, flint, chert, and which techniques spread between regions. They show us cultural frontiers, technological experiments, the rise of regional traditions and the death of others, all without a single bone, and perhaps that's the most humbling part. For all the importance we place on fossils, and they are important, the story of humanity is told just as much through what we made as who we were. Bones are rare. Tools are common. Bones tell us what a population looked like. Tools tell us what it knew and what it lost. Across tens of thousands of years, entire cultures may have risen, flourished, and collapsed, leaving behind only a scatter of flakes in a windswept plain. No temples, no graves, no stories, just the distant echo of coordination and the soft whisper of friction between stone and hand. So when we find tools without their makers, we aren't looking at absence. We're looking at survival, at the one thing that endured when everything else was taken by wind and time. And while we may never know the species, the name, or the language spoken, we know they were here, because their tools are here, and that's enough to ask the question, if they made these tools, what else did they make? What else was lost? And if every artifact is a decision made long ago, then how many decisions have we missed, and how many stories were never written down? If we got out so early, why didn't we stay? It is one of the most quietly haunting questions in paleoanthropology, because the deeper we look, the more we find that Homo sapiens was not a late bloomer. We didn't hesitate. We didn't wait for some magical threshold of intelligence or tool sophistication. We stepped out of Africa early, multiple times, into lands already claimed by other humans. By 210,000 years ago, our bones were already in southern Europe. By 190,000 years ago, our jaws were in the caves of Israel. By 120,000 years ago, we were burying our dead in Galilee. By 85,000 years ago, our fingers were touching the sand beside Arabian lakes. And by 100,000 years ago, our teeth were already in southern China. But none of these people are with us today. They left no lineage, no branch, no country, just scattered traces across continents, disconnected from the ancestry of every living human. They were us, but their journey ended, and somehow they all vanished. To understand why, we have to abandon the myth that evolution is a story of steady triumph. For most of our existence, Homo sapiens was not a world conqueror. We were a fragile, localized, small-brained hominin living among giants. At 200,000 years ago, our range was still likely limited to parts of eastern and southern Africa. There were no cities, no boats, no ranged weapons, no art that would survive time. And yet, for reasons still being debated, some of us started walking. Whether following game, water, or simply curiosity, early Homo sapiens populations dispersed beyond the African continent and met a world already full of humans. The problem is that leaving was not the same as lasting. Every single expansion attempt before 60,000 years ago failed. Not in the sense that no one survived the trip, they clearly did, but in the evolutionary sense. These early groups vanished without leaving direct descendants, and for the longest time, that seemed like a tragic mystery. But now, across paleoecology, genetics, and climate modelling, the outlines of the answer are beginning to take shape. And like most things in prehistory, it was probably not one reason, but many. The first, and simplest, is size. Any population that disperses across harsh terrain into unfamiliar ecosystems is going to start small, and small populations are biologically unlucky. A single drought, a failed harvest, a flu-like virus, or a minor shift in predator populations can erase an entire settlement. This isn't extinction on the level of dinosaurs, it's just the math of demography. A founder group of 40 or 50 individuals might not be able to sustain genetic diversity long term. One missed generation could wipe out a lineage. And when you layer in the seasonal unpredictability of Ice Age climates, where entire biomes could change within centuries, these expansion attempts start to look less like heroic voyages and more like gambles against entropy. Second, geography. While Africa is often imagined as a closed box, it is more accurate to think of it as a continent with thresholds. The Levant, the Horn of Africa, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait were all migration choke points. When global climates were favourable, during warm interglacials, green corridors opened up, lakes, rivers, savannas. When they weren't, those same routes became deserts, salt flats, or impassable bottlenecks. So it wasn't just a matter of getting out, it was staying out, and staying connected. If those routes closed behind a population, they might become stranded, cut off from the larger gene pool, vulnerable to inbreeding, or overwhelmed by local environmental change. A few hundred kilometres could become an evolutionary prison. Third, technology. Though the stone tools of early Homo sapiens were as sophisticated as those of other human species at the time, especially 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀 and prepared flake techniques, they didn't necessarily offer an advantage. They were clever, but not disruptive. We were not yet using long blades or bone harpoons. There were no bows, no nets, no tailored clothing for Ice Age winters. We were not outpacing the Neanderthals in toolkits. In fact, in some areas, it was the opposite. Neanderthals had fire-hardened spears, they had hafted tools, they had robust hunting strategies for large game, and they had been living in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. So the early Homo sapiens groups arriving in these regions may not have had a technological edge at all. In fact, they might have been slightly behind. Then there's the ecological factor. The world outside Africa was not empty. It was full of competitors, not only Neanderthals and Denisovans, but also local fauna, large carnivores, unfamiliar disease ecologies, and fluctuating resources. In parts of Western Asia and Europe, the megafauna included cave lions, saber-toothed cats, and giant bears. These were not animals adapted to fear Homo sapiens yet. In Africa, our ancestors co-evolved with large predators. They had time to learn each other's moves. But in Europe and Asia, that co-evolutionary dance hadn't happened yet. We were walking into someone else's arena, under someone else's rules. And the rules were not kind. Even when resources were available, the cost of survival may have exceeded the benefit. Small groups of Homo sapiens may have succeeded in building temporary shelters, hunting local game, even adapting seasonal movements. But without the density or social structure to thrive across generations, they may have simply withered out. Genetic drift, lack of mates, resource strain. Any of these could unravel a lineage in just a few lifespans. The archaeological record supports this. In place after place, from Apodema to Misliya to Dioxyan, we find signs of early sapiens' presence. Skull fragments, teeth, tools, but no continuity. No long cultural layers, no progression, just a sudden appearance, and just as sudden a disappearance. And then there's the social factor. It is entirely possible that Homo sapiens were not welcome everywhere they went. The world of 200,000 to 80,000 years ago was not a blank canvas. It was already home to other intelligent, upright hominins. Neanderthals were well established across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans occupied parts of Eastern Asia. And though the fossil record is still too thin to fully describe their range, we now know that both groups were highly adapted to their environments, with regional variation and deep history. An early Homo sapiens group wandering into these areas may have been met with competition, hostility, or at the very least, a lack of interbreeding until much later. And without alliances or integration, these groups may have simply been outcompeted or absorbed without trace. Which brings us to the final and most uncomfortable reason. Maybe nothing went wrong. Maybe this was just how it always goes. Species don't spread in straight lines. They surge, recede, attempt, fail, and try again. Evolution is not a single heroic migration. It is waves on a beach. Some leave patterns, some don't. The fact that these early dispersals failed might not be a puzzle to solve, but an expectation to accept. Most species that attempt a new niche fail. Most lineages end. It is only in hindsight, from our global perch in the present, that we imagine that success was inevitable, that Homo sapiens was always destined to rule the planet. But from the perspective of 80,000 years ago, nothing was guaranteed. What is remarkable is not that we failed, but that we kept trying, that even after each loss, another group still wandered out, that across 150,000 years, we kept testing the edges of the known world, we kept moving, and eventually one of those movements would stick. Around 60,000 years ago, a population would emerge, not necessarily smarter, not necessarily stronger, but perhaps just lucky enough to endure. And they would carry with them echoes of all those earlier attempts, not in their DNA, perhaps, but in their footsteps, in the way they learned to adapt, to persist, and to remember. So when we ask why the early Homo sapiens migrations failed, we might also be asking, what is the cost of becoming global? How many vanished cousins does it take to shape a survivor? And how many stories did we lose before we found our way? What if the reason we vanished was weather? Not a predator, not a rival, not even some grand mistake. Just the sky shifting one season too soon, the rains that forgot to come back, the wind that carried no seeds. Somewhere between 80,000 and 70,000 years ago, the planet cooled, quietly but relentlessly. And in that narrowing window of habitability, the great first migrations of Homo sapiens began to fade like footprints in a drying lake bed. The Earth, of course, has always breathed in ice and exhaled warmth. Its glacial rhythms long preceded us. But we arrived during one of its gentler exhalations, a relatively warm period known as marine isotope stage 5. It was the kind of epoch that makes rivers swell and corridors bloom. Northern Africa was green. Arabia held freshwater lakes. Temperate belts stretched farther than usual. And in those expanding ecological pockets, our species spread. Slowly, fitfully, and not always with permanence. The skulls in the Levant, the jaw in Israel, the finger in Arabia, they all belong to that interglacial optimism. But so do the absences that follow. The shift from marine isotope stage 5 to stage 4 was neither abrupt nor symmetrical. The warmth did not simply vanish in a single year. It crept away unevenly, like a tide pulling back from scattered shores. What once had been lakes began to retreat. Grasslands browned at the edges, monsoon systems wavered, and the zones that had made migration viable began to collapse. The corridors that once guided us turned into traps. For early Homo sapiens, who had ventured into these new regions in small numbers, the land itself may have been their undoing. In Africa, sediment cores from Lake Malawi tell part of the story. Around 74,000 years ago, the lake level dropped drastically, revealing a drier phase that lasted several thousand years. Further north in the now deserted regions of the eastern Sahara, Paleolake basins dried into salt flats. Fossil riverbeds, once active during the earlier interglacial, show no renewed flow during this colder period. Where there had been access to water and prey, there was now only dust and stone. And for groups living near the edge of ecological viability, this would have been catastrophic. It was not just the lack of water. The drop in global temperatures during marine isotope stage 4, estimated to be as much as 6 degrees Celsius in some regions, compressed habitable zones. The edges of forest retreated. Steppe environments replaced woodlands. In Europe and Western Asia, advancing glaciers and permafrost encroached on previously temperate regions, and with this came ecological instability. Megafaunal populations shifted, fragmented, or vanished entirely in some places. The seasonal predictability of resources so crucial for mobile hunter-gatherers became unreliable, patterns broke, routes failed. For Homo sapiens who had left Africa during the earlier warm phase, this mattered more than we often admit. These early migrants were not large populations. The genetic and archaeological record both suggest that the groups expanding into the Levant, Arabia, and perhaps even southern Asia were small, dispersed and demographically fragile. They may have numbered only in the hundreds or low thousands, a series of pulses rather than a wave. In biological terms, they were vulnerable to collapse. In statistical terms, they were already close to extinction the moment they left. Ecological collapse doesn't have to be global to be lethal. A single migration route drying out, a few key springs failing, one bad decade of hunting returns. These are not headlines. They are slow pressures that bend the branch until it breaks. And what makes the collapse of these early expansions even more invisible is that they may not have left bones behind. Fossilization is rare. Most of prehistory is an absence. If those first pulses dwindled into local disappearances, by famine, by dispersion, by conflict, or by birth rate alone, they could vanish entirely from the record. The archaeological silence in key regions during marine isotope stage 4 may reflect this disappearance. After the relatively dense human occupation in the Levant during the previous warm period, the layers between 75,000 and 65,000 years ago show fewer tools, fewer hearths, and fewer signs of sustained presence. Similar lulls appear in Arabia. The lake at Wusta dried, the wetlands in Nejd evaporated. Stone tool assemblages disappear from the record until they re-emerge tens of thousands of years later, and with them different styles, likely made by different groups. Even in regions with more continuous occupation, like parts of southern Africa, there are signs of environmental stress. In the interior regions of what is now Botswana, lake sediments show drying trends. Caves once occupied by humans reveal fewer artifacts. Occupation intensity drops. This does not mean complete abandonment, but it does suggest retraction. Homo sapiens may have retreated into ecological refugia, the oases of relative stability, clinging to river systems or coastal patches that remained viable. But in the new territories, the Levant, Arabia, the Horn of Africa's outer reaches, those refugees may not have existed, or they may have belonged to someone else. Because as the climate cooled, it wasn't just Homo sapiens who were affected. Neanderthals, long established in Europe and Western Asia, were adapted to colder conditions. Their persistence in the Levant during marine isotope stage 4 may reflect an ecological advantage. In sites like Tabun and Amud, Neanderthal occupation either begins or intensifies during this period, precisely when Homo sapiens' presence fades. The story is not one of sudden replacement, but rather a shift in viability. The world favoured a different build, and our lineage may have simply been outpaced by circumstance. The tools tell a partial story. The Levallois technique, widespread during the warmer phase, continues in some areas but with diminishing variation. In others, it is replaced or disappears entirely. This could reflect cultural drift, technological loss, or the arrival of new populations, or simply a thinning of the record due to demographic collapse. Fire use seems to decline in some regions, though whether from environmental limitation or cultural change remains uncertain. The problem, as always, is that absence is not evidence. But it is still a kind of clue. It's tempting to imagine that a dramatic external force must have caused these collapses. A volcanic eruption, perhaps, or a plague, something cinematic. But sometimes, The force is as simple as wind patterns shifting over the Indian Ocean, a reduction in solar radiation that nudges monsoons away from their usual path, a subtle drop in sea surface temperature that changes everything downstream. Climate operates with quiet power. And over decades or centuries it can erase the margins of a species' world without a single alarm. By 70,000 years ago, most of the early Homo sapiens dispersals appear to have failed. Not violently, not suddenly, but by retreat and erasure. The jawbones in Israel, the ornaments in Galilee, the tools in Oman, all left behind by people who no longer had descendants in those places. The early seeds of our global expansion did not take root. The corridors had closed, the rain had shifted, the climate, indifferent to the hopes of its cleverest ape, had simply moved on. We often look back at prehistory as if it were a straight road, from caves to cities, from napped flint to orbiting satellites. But the road was not straight. It forked, looped, collapsed, and sometimes vanished beneath the sand. The story of Homo sapiens is not just one of triumph. It is also a story of attempts, of expansions that failed, of lives remembered only by the silence that followed them. And perhaps the most humbling part is this. We didn't know why it happened, and we still don't know everything. We see the dust in the sediment, the gap in the record, the pattern of retreat. But whether they starved, scattered, or were folded into other groups, we can't say. All we know is that they were there, and then they weren't. What happens to a species when the world no longer makes room for it? When the doors once open begin to close? When a species is clever enough to explore, but not yet clever enough to survive everywhere? That is the question buried in the cold sediments of 70,000 years ago. Did we expand inward when the doors closed outward? It's a question that doesn't fit neatly into maps or migration arrows. Most of the grand narratives of Homo sapiens are drawn toward the exit signs, the coasts, the corridors, the departures. We fixate on the roots out of Africa, the bones on foreign soil, the footprints on new frontiers. But what if some of the most critical chapters in our story didn't unfold on the road out, but in the space behind the door? What if, when the world began to close in around 80,000 years ago, we didn't disappear, we just turned around? The period between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago is usually remembered for the migrations that didn't last. The brief appearances of Homo sapiens in southern Europe, the Levant, Arabia, maybe even East Asia, followed by silence. But within Africa, the same window may have seen something different. Not an extinction, not a collapse, but a rearrangement, a re-expansion, a reshuffling of people and ideas across a continent that was never just a backdrop, but always the main stage. In the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, the cave site of Moshena Barago preserves a remarkable record. It lies in the southwest, not far from the Rift Valley escarpments, an ecologically rich zone fed by montane rainforests and volcanic soils. Excavations here have revealed stratified Middle Stone Age tools stretching back well beyond 50,000 years. The layers between roughly 80,000 and 70,000 years ago show continuity. People were present, and they stayed. No signs of cultural regression, no break in occupation. Just persistence, quiet and local, in the middle of a continent often treated as empty space between more glamorous finds. To the south, in the Sotilo Hills of Botswana, another story emerges. Though long known for later Holocene rock art, the area also contains stone tools and occupation evidence from much earlier phases, including potential signs of activity during this very period. Though dating remains cautious, what's clear is that southern Africa was not a passive periphery. People lived here, and as climate shifts altered the viability of transcontinental routes, internal landscapes like these may have become refuges or even hubs. The real clue, though, comes from the tools. Across Central, Eastern and Southern Africa, there is a strange simultaneity in Middle Stone Age technologies between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago. Sites thousands of kilometres apart, from Sibudu Cave in South Africa to Aduma in Ethiopia, display similar patterns, finely retouched points, prepared cores, and blades. In some regions, microlithic technologies begin to appear earlier than expected. In others, hafting techniques become more widespread. None of these patterns suggest stasis. They suggest experimentation, regional innovation emerging in parallel. What's striking is that this technological diversity does not appear to be driven by isolation. In fact, It may be the opposite. Some researchers now argue that the Africa of this period was not a patchwork of sealed-off populations, but a braided network of small, semi-connected groups. Population genetics supports this. Studies of modern African genomes, when modelled backward in time, show signs of deep structure, meaning that early Homo sapiens within Africa were not a single homogeneous group, but a collection of related but distinct populations, occasionally exchanging genes, ideas, and perhaps tools. It was less a tree with a single trunk and more a woven river delta. Sites like Pangaea Saidi in Kenya offer a glimpse into this kind of cultural fluidity. While better known for its later Holocene layers, its deeper sediments contain Middle Stone Age deposits dating to at least 78,000 years ago. The tools here don't fit neatly into established typologies. They mix flake-based and blade-based production. They show signs of local adaptation. It's as if people were experimenting with what worked, not following a strict inherited pattern, but adjusting to their own ecological needs. This, too, is innovation. In the caves of the eastern coastal escarpments, like Qafzeh River and Border Cave in South Africa, Middle Stone Age occupations stretch deep into this period. At Qafzeh, hearths, shellfish remains, and bone fragments reveal a complex subsistence strategy, not just hunting but coastal foraging. The layers show continuity and variation. Fire was used, diets shifted, strategies adapted, and here too the tools evolve. Bladelets, backed pieces, evidence of hafting. Nothing suggests collapse. Instead, the opposite, persistence under pressure. But perhaps the most intriguing site for this question is the still mysterious site of Magabike in Tanzania. It is one of several lesser-known localities that may hold key insights into how human populations moved internally during this window. While the published material remains limited, early dates suggest occupation possibly spanning parts of this time frame. It's another point on the map that hints at what's been forgotten. The inland frontiers, the stories without sea breezes, the people who didn't leave because they didn't need to. There's a quiet irony here. As the outside world was becoming less habitable, cooling, drying, narrowing, the interior of Africa may have become the site of renewal. Not a golden age, not a single cradle, but a dynamic network of adaptations. This doesn't mean there was peace or stability. Climate stresses were felt here too. But rather than fading out, populations may have flowed inward, regrouping, mixing, and innovating in places the traditional migration maps don't mark. And yet, this return is not recorded in dramatic bones or sweeping transitions. It's recorded in sediment layers, in slowly shifting tool types, in subtle changes to site use. There is no grand narrative, just the evidence of people staying alive. If this re-expansion model is correct, it helps explain something else. The eventual success of the Homo sapiens dispersal around 60,000 years ago. That later wave may have drawn not from a single ancestral population, but from the recombined genetic and cultural legacies of these earlier re-expansions. What looked like failure outside may have been resilience inside. And when the world opened again, the descendants of these internal networks were ready. It also forces us to reconsider how we visualize our past. The African continent is not a background. It's not a launching pad. It is the main story. And for tens of thousands of years it was the only story. While we vanished from caves abroad, we endured at home. We mixed, we innovated, and we passed on knowledge, not as a monolith, as a chorus. So, did we expand inward when the doors closed outward? The evidence suggests we did, and in doing so we kept something alive, a continuity of presence, a thread of adaptation that no climate could cut. But it also raises a haunting question. How much of that inland history have we lost? How many frontiers within Africa remain unexplored, unexcavated, forgotten by a research history that pointed its gaze too quickly beyond? And what stories still lie buried, far from the coasts? What if the real mystery is how many versions of us died? Not in some violent apocalypse, not in a single moment of extinction, but slowly, quietly, over tens of thousands of years, in landscapes that changed, in rivers that dried, in rituals no one remembered to pass down. The early story of Homo sapiens is not a straight line. It is a latticework of vanished paths, and if we could see them all, the lost branches, the almosts, the ones who became no one, we might have to rethink what it means to be us. For much of the 20th century, scientists talked about human origins as if it were a tidy emergence. One species, one place, one moment, a clear upgrade from whatever came before. But the real story, as we now begin to understand it, is messier, less like a dawn and more like a long, low thunder. Homo sapiens did not arrive in a single body. We arrived as a pattern, a collection of overlapping populations spread across the African continent between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, some with features we'd recognise, some we wouldn't. At Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, fossils dating to roughly 315,000 years ago show a mixture of traits. The face is flat, the teeth small, recognisably modern, but the brain case is long and low, not the rounded vault we think of as typical Homo sapiens. It's us, but not quite. The same can be said of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒 in Ethiopia, dated to around 195,000 years ago, or 𝐓𝐏𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒, dated to about 160,000. Some skulls are robust, others more graceful. Some have prominent brow ridges, others do not. There is no single, modern form, just a scattering of experiments in humanity. And those are just the fossils we've found. What we now suspect, based on genetics, archaeology, and the eerie gaps in both, is that the African continent once held a far greater diversity of human lineages than the handful that survived. Ghost lineages, they're sometimes called. Populations that left traces in genomes, but no bones, or whose bones have crumbled in places too wet, too acidic, too lost to preserve them. These were not different species, they were human. But their version of being human did not make it to the present. Some groups may have lived in the deep interior of the Congo Basin, isolated by forests. Others may have roamed the ancient grasslands of what is now the Central Sahara, when it still held lakes and hippos. Still others could have occupied mountain ranges we've never surveyed, or coastlines now buried beneath the sea, each group with its own dialects, diets, skin tones and cosmologies, none of which we will ever recover. What unites them is not their disappearance, it's their participation in the grand experiment of becoming us. In paleoanthropology, the question of what it means to be anatomically modern is more philosophical than it sounds. Is it a rounded skull? A projecting chin? A certain ratio of limb length to torso? Or is it something else? The ability to adapt to different ecologies, to innovate, to form complex social bonds? If we found a skull with some but not all of these traits, do we call it almost us? Or just a variation of us? The reality is that evolution doesn't care about our categories. The traits we label modern likely appeared in mosaic. A group in one region might have had a rounded brain case, but archaic jaws. Another might have used symbolic pigments but had more robust bones. Traits did not appear in lockstep. They flowed, like language or rumour, between groups over thousands of years. Some became widespread, others didn't. Some faded when the population carrying them vanished in a drought or a war, or simply didn't leave enough children. And here's the haunting part. Most of those traits, most of those groups, are gone. There is no fossil record complete enough to map them all. No archaeological layer that shows the moment one lineage replaced another, but the genetic hints remain. Modern African populations today contain levels of diversity that dwarf those of the rest of the world, a signal that deep population structure existed long before any migration outward. Some of that structure comes from groups that no longer exist. They left their imprint but not their name. What might those people have been like? What songs did they sing? What tools did they carry? What did they believe about the stars? We may never know. But their absence has shape. At certain African sites, researchers find toolkits that don't fit the standard sequences. Microliths, where there shouldn't be microliths. Patterns of retouch that suggest different training, different priorities, but no associated skeletons, no graves, just the detritus of vanished lives. At other sites, bones are found, fragmentary, worn, that don't match known types. But without more, we can't place them. They are the ones we almost became, and that phrase, almost became, doesn't mean lesser. It doesn't mean primitive. It just means lost. Evolution is not progress. It is survival, filtered through time. Some lineages didn't make it to the present, not because they were inferior, but because they were unlucky. A bad season, a failed alliance, a drying well. The difference between extinction and continuity can be as small as weather. It's possible that one of these lost populations had its own version of language, its own myths, that somewhere, sometime, a now extinct group of early Homo sapiens invented a symbol system, a gesture or rhythm, that no one else adopted. That culture died with them, not because it wasn't worthy, but because no one remained to remember it. And so the version of Homo sapiens that survived, the version that emerged around 60,000 years ago and eventually spread across the globe, is not the inevitable endpoint of a long process. It is just one outcome among many, the product of blending, bottlenecks, and blind luck. A survivor, not a superior. We are not the final draft of humanity. We are the one that didn't go extinct, and that should be enough to make us humble. Because the more we learn, the more we realize how many versions of us were possible, and how few remain. So next time someone says we started in Africa, it's worth asking, which we? The upright walker with the sloped skull and long limbs, the tall-bodied fish-eater with narrow hips, the forest-dwelling toolmaker whose language is gone, the woman buried with red ochre whose DNA is now a ghost. There was never just one kind of us, there were many, and most of them are gone. But in their absence we carry the echo. We are not alone in the story of our species. We are the children of experiments, and the ones who almost were. What changed when we finally made it? For over 100,000 years, Homo sapiens had tried and failed to leave Africa behind. We had reached new lands, peered across strange horizons, made campfires in unfamiliar caves, and yet, again and again, we vanished. Not entirely, but enough to leave no lasting trace. Small groups scattered by climate, by competition, by chance. A species on the cusp of something, but not quite there. Then, sometime between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, something shifted. And this time, it worked. This time, we didn't just wander, we didn't just arrive. We endured, we spread, we stayed. So what changed? The bones do not shout the answer. The stones do not etch it in certainty. But the pattern suggests that our species, somewhere during this narrow window, crossed an invisible threshold, not in anatomy, not in raw brain size, but in behaviour. We became not just clever, but consistently clever. We began to act with foresight, with coordination, with symbolic abstraction, and perhaps most importantly, we began to act together, in groups large and cohesive enough to survive the unknown. There was no single innovation that unlocked this success, no golden spear or sacred fire. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of shifts. Take, for example, the emergence of projectile technology. Prior to this period, most known tools suggest thrusting weapons, spears held in hand, used at close range, but evidence begins to appear for projectiles. Things thrown, things launched, tools that separate the body from the strike, microliths mounted into shafts, carefully crafted points that require forethought, planning, and, crucially, shared teaching. This alone would change the rules of survival. Hunting at distance reduces risk. It increases efficiency. It enables ambush, cooperation, and communication. It requires knowledge of animal movement, terrain, and timing. It is not just a new tool, it is a new way of thinking. Alongside this, symbolic expression becomes more persistent. At sites like Blombos Cave in southern Africa, ochre with cross-hatched engraving appears, not randomly but regularly. Shell beads drilled and strung into ornaments, patterns of pigment use. These are not necessities of survival, they are necessities of identity. They speak to shared meaning, group cohesion, memory. They are not decorations, they are declarations. We are this group and not that one. It's not that these behaviours didn't exist earlier. They did, in flashes, a shell here, an engraving there. But now they became durable, regular, taught across generations. Culture had emerged, not as a spark, but as a fire that no longer needed relighting. And perhaps that was the key. Because culture is a multiplier. It allows information to accumulate, not just within a single mind, but across time. It creates a memory that outlives the body. And when Homo sapiens crossed that threshold, we stopped being just another clever ape. We became a collective intelligence, not always wise, but capable of remembering more than one lifetime. This cultural consolidation is reflected in the archaeological record. Toolkits become more standardized across regions. Hafting techniques improve. Heat treatment of stone becomes common. Points are designed not just for function, but for replication. Teaching becomes embedded. A child born into one of these communities could learn more in 15 years than a lone innovator might stumble across in a lifetime. Knowledge had become shareable. This, in turn, changed our demographic reality. Groups could grow larger without fragmenting. Individuals could specialize. Risk could be distributed. And as groups expanded, they could carry culture with them, not just genes. Each expansion now carried the seeds of continuity. The social world, too, seems to have deepened. Burials become more complex. Evidence of care for the injured and elderly appears with greater frequency. Some skeletons show signs of long-term healing, injuries that would have been fatal without support. This is not just adaptation, it is affiliation. Empathy had become part of the toolkit. But perhaps the most invisible change was cognitive. To migrate successfully across hostile terrain, a group must imagine what it cannot see. A mountain behind the hill, a river beyond the ridge, a memory of abundance that requires return. This is not instinct. It is abstract planning, mental time travel. And it is difficult to see in stone, but its consequences are everywhere. In the regularity of tool types, in the coordination of hunts, in the symbolic marks left on cave walls and beads. Homo sapiens began to operate in deep time, and with that came maps, not on parchment, but in memory. Landmarks remembered, seasonal shifts predicted, routes recited in rhythm. Knowledge passed not through writing, but through repetition and ritual, and because it was shared, it could spread. By 65,000 years ago, signs of this shift are found across Africa. From the coastlines of South Africa to the river valleys of Sudan, toolkits converge in complexity. Symbolic artifacts persist, and while exact dates are debated, the archaeological horizon begins to brighten. Not with brilliance, but with regularity. This was not a revolution, it was a coalescence, and it set the stage for something larger, a migration that would succeed where others had failed. A movement not of lost scouts, but of cultures prepared to endure. When the next door opened, through the Horn of Africa, perhaps along a green corridor, Homo sapiens didn't just leave. They brought their world with them. It's easy, in retrospect, to see this moment as destined. But it wasn't. It was fragile. The groups that succeeded were still small, the route still dangerous, the climate still uncertain. But now, the travellers were not alone in the wild. They were part of something larger, a lineage that could remember, communicate, teach. The last try worked not because we became superhuman, but because we became reliably human. And that raises the haunting question, what if it hadn't happened? What if the ochre hadn't been carved, the point not hafted, the idea not taught? How many times did it almost happen before? How many times did culture flicker and fail? And what made this time different? That question still echoes through the caves, through the bones, through the beads. We don't know exactly why this try worked, only that it did, and everything that followed started here. What do we owe the ones who walked before us and never returned? It's easy to forget them, because forgetting is what deep time does best. Erosion smooths the edges, ash covers the footprints, and the silence that follows extinction is often quieter than we expect. No tragedy, no memorial, just absence. For every Homo sapiens alive today, there are countless others who are not. Not because they failed, not because they were less than us, but because they were human, and that was never a guarantee of survival. From 300,000 to 60,000 years ago, the Earth was home to a population of humans far more diverse than we are willing to imagine. Some had our faces, some didn't. Some left behind tools, pigments, beads, others left almost nothing, not even a name. We look back now and trace their paths, across dunes, through caves, over rivers long dry, and all we see are echoes, campsites never returned to, stone flakes beneath collapsed ceilings, a jaw, broken and buried, without descendants. Why did they disappear? The question is too large for certainty, but not too large to ask. Some were likely undone by climate. A fertile corridor that dried just one season too soon. A lake that shifted its shoreline. A herd that never came back. These early humans lived at the edge of predictability, and even small changes could tilt the balance. The migration corridors of the Pleistocene were not stable highways. They were pulses, wet phases, green windows, that closed as quickly as they opened. Being in the wrong valley at the wrong time could mean being forgotten forever. Others may have vanished through isolation. Small groups breaking off, settling too far from others to maintain contact. Genetic drift, cultural loss, collapse. Not through failure, but through fragmentation. A group too small to weather the unexpected. A flu, a drought, an argument that split them down the middle. Still others may have disappeared not because of the environment, but because of us, or others like us. Human competition is not new. And when two populations meet in marginal terrain, it does not always end in handshake or fusion. Sometimes one simply fades, slowly, without violence, just lower birth rates, fewer surviving children, fewer elders to pass down memory. And then there are the stories we'll never recover, the groups that left nothing we've found, whose territories were never excavated, whose tools didn't preserve, whose languages never reached a listener who would write them down. If they painted, the walls have collapsed. If they sang, the wind was louder. If they loved, and they surely did, we will never know the names. What all of them share is this. They were human. Not hypotheticals, not almosts, not experiments. People. With seasons, tools, worries, laughter. And now they are gone. When we study them, it's tempting to call them failed migrations, unsuccessful expansions, dead ends. But failure is a word for goals unmet, and we don't know what they intended. They weren't walking to populate a map. They were living, moving, trying to make it one more season, one more generation, like us. So what do we owe them? We owe them honesty. The humility to admit that survival is not superiority, that our existence is not proof of being better, only of being luckier, more connected, more able to endure a chain of improbabilities. The Homo sapiens who made it weren't chosen. They were persistent. That's enough. We owe them curiosity, the will to reconstruct their lives not as curiosities but as kin, to look at their tools and ask not just what they did, but what they meant, to remember that behind every bone is a story, even if we can't tell it. And maybe most of all, we owe them presence, the awareness that we are not the first to wonder, that others have looked up at unfamiliar stars and asked how they got there, that before there were cities, there were camps, before there were nations, there were footprints. Before we were a species that circled the globe, we were a collection of wanderers, some of whom never made it out of the forest. They weren't just our past, they were our possibilities. For every lineage that led to us, there were others that ended in silence. For every ancestor whose DNA persists, there are thousands more whose names are unspoken. But even in absence, they shaped us. Every extinction narrowed the path. Every survival taught something. We are the result of all of them, including the ones we do not remember. And when we ask, why did they disappear? We are really asking, why did we not? There is no final answer. Just this. We walk on bones. Every continent we reach was first imagined by someone we forgot. Every fire we light carries the warmth of experiments long gone. And every time we ask who we are, we echo a question that others asked, and carried into the dark. So next time you hear the word human, let it include more than us. Let it include the ones who carved shells before anyone else wore them, the ones who buried children with antlers, the ones who lived and died in caves now collapsed, the ones who held hands as their campfire went out, the ones we almost became. They may be gone, but they walked the path first, and the silence behind us is theirs. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do, like subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.